Global trade war. The U.S. president is now just 7 hours away from revealing his hardline tariff strategy. Why today's announcement could forever change the way the world does business. Export anxiety. Trump's tariffs are putting Canadian businesses and entire communities on edge.
Uncertainty that is really driving a lot of anxiety amongst people. So Liberation Day for us will be somewhat liberating, just understanding what the numbers look like.
This morning, the potential consequences for the Canadian economy. And Trump's tariffs shake up the federal election campaign. Liberal Leader Mark Carney is taking on his prime minister's role today, and we'll tell you what he and the other leaders are doing on this day 11. We begin a day of special coverage for you here on CBC News Network on what is expected to be a major escalation in the U.S. trade war on Canada. This is shaping up to be a pivotal day for Canada's economy, for Canadians' livelihoods, and for this country's relationship with the United States. A powerful economic shock is coming today from the White House. And that's our focus to begin this hour. As we look live at Washington, we know that U.S. President Donald Trump, from the Rose Garden of the White House, will announce what he calls reciprocal tariffs on Canada and every other country that trades with America. Almost everything that Canadians produce and sell to the U.S. will be hit with a tariff. Just how high it will be, that's still unknown. We do know the Trump administration is attempting something unprecedented in the modern era, using punishing tariffs to bend global trade and the world economy to benefit the United States.
They're not going to be wrong. It is going to work. And the president has a brilliant team of advisors who have been studying these issues for decades. And we are focused on restoring the golden age of America.
We're still waiting to hear from Trump himself, but there is reporting from U.S. media outlets he's been huddling with his top trade advisors. And in the words of the White House press secretary, perfecting his tariff plan. Right now, just hours before that announcement, there is some breaking news on another major tariff hit for this country. We're talking about those across-the-board tariffs Trump is using to back up his demands that Canada tighten border security. Those tariffs have been on pause for the most part, but as Katie Nicholson tells us from Washington, we're learning this morning that pause is now officially over.
Those are that first round of tariffs, the 25% on goods, 10% energy critical minerals, potash. It was originally that the U.S. agreed to suspend tariffs on CUSMA-compliant businesses until today, April 2nd. So the question is, what happens to that today? Ottawa-based international trade lawyer William Pellerin told us this morning that that exemption that had been giving Canadian business so much breathing room in all of this chaos, unless it is renewed today, those tariffs are likely coming into effect. Here is lawyer William Pellerin.
Proving that CUSMA origination was a very, very big deal and allowed companies over the last few weeks to save vast amounts of tariffs and continue to ship to the United States duty-free. It is that exemption that is now lifted that is going to cause a lot of harm in the coming days unless it's renewed, and we'll learn more about that from the Rose Garden this afternoon.
Whatever is announced today at 4 p.m., those tariffs are supposed to be effective immediately. So that is a bit of a stunning assertion because we don't know what these tariffs are going to be looking like. What are they going? How are they going to be structured? Are they going to be customized in some way for specific countries, or are we talking about a flat rate on imports? You have to really sort of zoom out for a second, Heather. It's that the U.S. imports about $3.2 trillion worth of goods every year. So if you can try to imagine for a second trying to implement sort of across-the-board tariffs and something like that so quickly on so many products, it's sort of mind-boggling, right? It's a bit of a recipe for chaos. So the question is, what are the markets going to do? What are the retaliatory plans that we are going to hear from the U.S.'s trading partners? So that would be Canada, Mexico, and China, whose foreign minister described all of this as blackmail and said that they're ready to counterattack. You've got the European Commission also talking tough. So beyond all of that, beyond the sort of the fraught international reaction and the market volatility that this is expected to spark, there's also fears that this could really further fray and weakened America's alliances with other countries, depending on how big and wide-ranging these tariffs are today. And of course, then there are the effects at home. Now, granted, we still don't know exactly what to expect today, but people have been trying to figure out what the impact is going to be on American consumers. So over at the Yale Budget Lab, they've put together some estimates, and they believe that this plan could end up costing the average American consumer anywhere from $2,700 to $3,400 a year. And all of this is coming as consumer confidence is plummeting in this country. People are spending less. And you can bet when all of that, when it starts to affect people in their homes, at the kitchen table, that's when you can bet there is going to be a bit of a political price for all of this if these calculations are off, this big gamble for tariffs.
Katie Nicholson from Washington, and next to Canada's capital as we look live at Parliament Hill and await possible repercussions, possible retaliation for those tariffs here at home. Liberal Leader Mark Carney is off the campaign trail. We know he's back in Ottawa this morning, and he will be acting in his role as Prime Minister today to hold some key meetings, his Cabinet Committee and also the Prime Minister's Canada-U.S. Council on U.S.-Canada relations. That's meeting today, too. We'll hear this hour from Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre, and this is the scene for that address, a keynote address to supporters in Toronto. Whenever that begins, it was set for 9:30 a.m. Eastern. It may begin a little bit earlier. Whenever it does, we will bring you live coverage here on CBC Morning Live. Kate McKenna is in Ottawa, looking ahead to one of the things the leaders are likely to talk about today, and that's another tariff announcement that is going to be upending the campaign. Tell us a little bit more about how the leaders are likely to address this and how trade and tariffs and Donald Trump are again affecting the campaigns, Kate.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tariffs today. That is going to be the main story coming out of the campaign today, and possibly the ballot question. One of the big things that's on Canadians' minds as they go to the polls this month, in fact, later this month. So we know that Mark Carney's back in Ottawa. As you said, he's meeting with his Council on U.S.-Canada relations before that 4 p.m. Donald Trump announcement. And then after that, he's meeting with his Cabinet Committee on U.S.-Canada relations. He has said that Canada plans to retaliate if Donald Trump, when Donald Trump moves forward with more tariffs on this country, but we don't yet know the scope of that retaliation. It might depend on what Trump does today. We've received indications from the Prime Minister, from some premiers, that Canada might be less targeted by this set of tariffs than other countries, and that could affect the country's retaliation plan. Last night, Mark Carney and Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre both had rallies, and both of them spoke at length about this issue.
I said I reject any attempts to weaken Canada. Any attempts to wear us down. Any attempts to break us so that America can own us.
The question in this election will be whether we continue to weaken our economy and hand over our resources to an increasingly unpredictable and hostile American leadership, or whether we bring home the production here. Bring it home.
So we saw that live shot just a minute ago. We are expecting to hear from Pierre Poilievre in the next hour, most likely on tariffs. But both leaders have presented their plans, or parts of their plans, for how they would handle Donald Trump if elected Prime Minister. Pierre Poilievre has focused largely on building economic resilience to have greater leverage in the face of Trump's tariff threats, to be in a better bargaining position. And in his view, that would look perhaps like an west to east pipeline within Canada, getting more energy projects going, encouraging investment through tax cuts and other incentives. Mark Carney has also said that he wants to see more resource projects go ahead. In his brief time as Prime Minister, he's traveled to Europe to try and shore up more trade and security alliances there. And he's been quite candid in his remarks, saying that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. Is now changed. It is not the same, and it will not be the same no matter what happens next. Meanwhile, Poilievre has called for Trump to knock it off and return to a normal trade relationship. Now, today, Jagmeet Singh is in Winnipeg. He'll be meeting with workers. We know that supports for people who are affected by these tariffs has been a key plank in his messaging in this electoral race. But what we'll be looking at this afternoon is what comes out of these two meetings that the Prime Minister is set to have. First, before the announcement, this Council on U.S.-Canada Relations. This is a collection of industry and labor experts. Flavio Volpe is on the council. He says it's about advising the Prime Minister.
Especially in a time like this where Washington doesn't know what it's doing 4 hours before, there are some people who have better relationships than others, and some who have a global view, talking to the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans. And certainly we're going to share all of that with the Prime Minister and government officials, and then talk about a path forward.
After that, Carney is set to meet with his cabinet committee, and it's unclear at this point if we're going to be hearing from him after that. Our colleague Olivia Stefanovic confirmed that he is planning on staying in Ottawa into the evening. He will not be flying somewhere to continue his campaign, so we'll be watching closely to see if he makes any sort of public remarks.
We certainly will. Kate, thank you very much. Kate McKenna with the latest information out of Ottawa. When we talk about tariffs to come today, the reciprocal tariffs, of course, steel and aluminum tariffs, they've been in effect since March the 12th. Businesses that rely on the industry may give us an idea about how others are going to be navigating what is to come in terms of the impact on pricing and the hit there. The CEO of the Collective Arts Brewery, think about things in aluminum cans. He's going to join us in just about 10 minutes to give us a sense of the impact tariffs have already had on businesses in this country. Windsor, Ontario is the auto capital of Canada, with auto tariffs coming tomorrow. Windsor is home to a Stellantis assembly plant, 2 Ford engine plants, many auto-related manufacturers, and there are thousands of workers there who are anxiously waiting to hear what President Trump announces this afternoon. Megan Fitzpatrick has moved to Windsor, and she's at City Hall this morning to hear from people and from the mayor as well in terms of what they are waiting for today and tomorrow in the new tariff announcements. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning, Heather. Yes, the auto workers here in this city are anxiously awaiting the details from President Donald Trump, and the mayor of Windsor is also anxiously awaiting those details. When we spoke to him a few minutes ago, he was talking about the frustration that he has been dealing with the last few weeks and months, really, not knowing exactly what these tariffs are going to look like and therefore how exactly they will impact his city here and the very important auto industry to this city, and then all the connecting industries to it, the manufacturing, the supply chain industries. They are bracing for impact, though, Heather. They know they will be hit very hard. This city has a long history with the auto industry, and thousands of jobs depend on it. So let's take a listen to what Mayor Drew Dilkens said about how bad this could be for his city.
It could be catastrophic, and we've said that from the very beginning. So a tariff, the 25% was the original number that was proposed. It would have an immediate impact on the auto industry and the parts sector here in the city of Windsor and throughout Essex County, but that would ripple all the way throughout Ontario. It would ripple all the way into the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And so I'm concerned about my community and the job loss in my community, but I'm also reassured by the fact that if it hits my community, it's going to hit the United States, and that's where the president is going to feel the economic pain.
And it could hit those states that voted for Donald Trump, he noted, Heather, including Michigan, which, of course, is just across the river from here in Windsor. And it also heavily depends on the auto industry. Drew Dilkens was saying, hopefully later today, the tariffs will be zero. I asked him if he still does have that hope, if he thinks there's any chance that Donald Trump might change his mind and not proceed with these tariffs on Canada. And he said if the president is listening to sensible advice, then he won't impose these tariffs. But then he said he also knows the president doesn't also listen to his advisors. And so while President Trump calls today Liberation Day, the mayor of Windsor is saying the liberation in the sense for the people here will be the liberation from the uncertainty that they've been dealing with. They just want to know if there are going to be tariffs, how much are they going to be, so then they can plan accordingly and move forward, Heather.
125,000 workers in Canada's auto industry, Megan, and so many of them are in the Windsor area. You've been speaking to some of them in advance of our conversation this morning. How are they feeling?
Well, we spoke to Chad Lawton yesterday, who is a worker at the Ford engine plant, and he's worked there for more than 30 years. He also works for the union representing those workers. His wife also works at the plant. His 2 sons work at the plant. He was noting, Heather, that his wife, on her side of the family, her family's connection to the Ford company dates back to when it first started in Canada in 1904. So he was saying that the words he used to describe the mood in the plant right now, fear and anxiety. He said older workers are worried about their retirement coming up, and younger workers are worried about their future and whether they have one in the auto industry or not. Very simply, people are worried about losing their jobs. Lawton saying the union is preparing for a fight. They are adamant that these auto jobs will stay on the Canadian side of the border. Here's more from Lawton.
Reality is, if push comes to shove and we have to fight for it, we will. And I think that there's a growing sentiment as this becomes real for many people that were hoping that it was going to go away on its own or we would talk our way through it, that these are Canadian jobs and we'll do what we have to do to protect them.
He went on to say that a piece of equipment would be removed from the Ford plant over his dead body, Heather. So he is preparing for a fight. One of the concerns he says they have right now in the short term is on the companies, the supply chain, really, the smaller parts companies that supply Ford to make those engines and to make those cars. He says a lot of those companies are small family businesses. It's doubtful that they could shoulder the cost of these tariffs. And if they are impacted and they go under, they go out of business, and Ford can't get the parts that it needs to build those engines, then he and his coworkers could be out of jobs. He thinks that those smaller part suppliers will be, quote, the first dominoes to fall. Now, in terms of what they're hearing from Ford, he says, you know, not a lot other than sort of broad commitments to the workforce, but he acknowledged it's hard for the companies to react right now when they don't know exactly what they're dealing with either. And we did talk to other people in the workforce yesterday. We stopped by the Stellantis plant as the shift change was happening late afternoon. Here's a little bit of what I was hearing.
It's scary, that's for sure. I mean, the thing is, with Trump over there, he's changing his mind every 2 seconds. So it's like, you know, one day you think you're working for the next like 3 months, and then the next day it's like, oh, we might be getting laid off like next week. So
we're confused. We don't know what's going to happen, but I mean, we're sticking together. We're going to get through together like we did with COVID and everything else that hit this place. We've survived, and I think we'll survive this too.
Until something actually happens, there's no sense in worrying about it. So that's all I have to say, really.
We know these workers, and Lawton said they will be watching closely for that news conference from President Trump later today, Heather, and they will be watching closely for Canada's response.
Megan, thank you very much. Megan Fitzpatrick with reporting out of Windsor all through this day. You heard a little bit in Kate's reporting just a few moments ago from Flavio Volpe, the president of the Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturers Association. More now from my conversation with him just last hour. He's going to be sitting on the Prime Minister's Council today, but he's warning that the new reciprocal tariffs coming in combination with across-the-board tariffs will shut down the North American auto industry in a matter of days.
We think within a week. S&P Global thinks within 5 business days. Cox Automotive said 2 weeks. Wedbush said 2 weeks. So 1 week or two, there really is no difference. What you have is hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of the border with the anxiety that, am I going to be working next week? And they're not worried about the price of eggs. They're worried about whether I can make rent. That's going to be the biggest problem for Donald Trump. These are in states that delivered the presidency. And when Mark Carney and previous to him, Justin Trudeau said, look, there's a limit to what we can do, although we will respond strongly, but we can't do anything to them that's worse than what they're about to do to themselves. Well, we're on the brink of that one again.
So you were... When auto tariffs were raised, that surprise announcement on the day of Signalgate to kind of deflect from that is what you suggested at the time. When that 25% came up, then there was all sorts of discussion. Would it be finished cars? Would it be parts? How much U.S. content was in the Canadian cars coming across? This was all keeping things very much up in the air. Yeah. We're going to find out about automotive tomorrow and then parts down the line. But what is the latest information you have as to what the number is for Canada? Do you know, you talked about maybe carve-outs, maybe exemptions, maybe a lower figure for Canada. What is the best info you're going on right now?
We don't know, and so this is, this is a little bit of educated guesswork and the gossip channels in D.C. What's important is that here we are, I don't know, 5-6 hours away, and the people that should know in D.C., that should actually communicate from a legislative point of view and a regulatory point of view should have said something, but would know what's happening this afternoon and say, we don't know. We may be at a 20% tariff level with these reciprocal tariffs. There might be country-specific tariffs. There might be some countries that get off because they're on a few others. It's the chaos of this administration that we're normalizing by talking about it every day, and we're getting a little bit inured to it. But when those things go through, people will lose jobs.
That's Flavio Volpe, as I spoke with him earlier this morning, and he'll be part of the virtual meeting at 3 o'clock this afternoon of the Prime Minister's Canada-U.S. Council on Relations. Mark Carney chairing that as Prime Minister, 3 o'clock Eastern, before the Cabinet Committee meeting later in the afternoon. CBC News has special coverage of everything to come today. The tariff announcement from the Rose Garden, that's scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern. Our chief correspondent, Adrian Arsenault, will host alongside chief political correspondent Rosemary Barton and the host of Power and Politics, David Cochran. They're beginning an hour earlier at 3 p.m. Eastern, and you can see it here on CBC News Network and everywhere you stream CBC News. This is CBC Morning Live. Our CBC News team flying the drone over Hamilton, Ontario. Steel and aluminum, of course, Hamilton Steel Town. It's already subject to punishing 25% tariffs, has been for nearly a month already. And now the rest of the country is holding its breath because U.S. President Trump set to announce reciprocal tariffs globally this afternoon. Canada and every other country that trades with America could end up with new levies. And so much industry and so many Canadians, owners and workers, are really holding their breath until we see what happens today, including my next guest, Matt Johnston, who's the CEO and the co-founder of the Collective Arts Brewery. Been in business since 2013, exports to a number of countries, but the U.S. is what we're talking about today. And here is Matt, right where the production happens in Hamilton. Welcome to our show, Matt. I'm delighted to meet you here. Thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks for having me on.
Listen, show me around a little bit. I'm interested. I mentioned beer. This number is pretty impressive, 4.8 million liters of beer from your brewery every year. But show me around, because I know it's not just beer that you make there.
Yeah, sure. So right now we're in our tap room. Do you want to go for a walk with us?
Sure, let's do a quick one for sure.
Okay, well, right now we're in our tap room. We'll walk back into the production area and just give you a quick piece.
Okay. This is where it's happening. Hello. Good morning. Hey, you even have your own cameraman, Matt. This is very good. Say thank you to whoever that is. Okay, so this is where it's happening there.
Behind the camera. So it's a little noisier out here, but you can see this is our packaging line. If Aaron shows you our packaging hall, and you can see the cans here, which are one of the key things in question for us. And then we have a similar space on the other side that would be all of our brewing side. So we're happy to walk you over there too.
No, that's okay. Let's just stay there for a moment because you mentioned the cans, and that's what we want to talk about. We know those steel and aluminum tariffs in place. How much of what you brew goes into cans? What percentage, Matt?
Sorry, that's loud going by me here.
Okay.
The can increases has been pretty impactful. It's one of the biggest inputs into our products. We've already seen considerable increases just because it's Canadian aluminum going down to the U.S. To be processed, but there's really no Canadian canning available to us. So the reality is we're getting hit by the tariffs coming back up, and then from there, we're concerned that there might be further tariffs on the aluminum cans. And unfortunately, we are all under contract.
With supply. Do you want to move? Because maybe you're not being able to hear me too well. We can move to a quieter area if you want.
We're going to move somewhere where it's quieter here.
That sounds good. So 85% is the number that your company provides of your product goes into those cans. And those cans, as Matt was saying, goes from Canada, the aluminum, down to the States to be processed and comes back across the border so that the U.S. tariffs hit going across and coming back, you may hit again. So twice it could be. So in terms of pricing, I know you were going to get some hard numbers for us, Matt. What have you seen already?
Right now on cans, which would be pretty well largest input on packaging, is about a 10% increase, and that's just obviously the impact of raw aluminum going down. And then if we get hit further, that will go up considerably. We also have threats. Our freight rates have gone up by about 60% crossing the border. And then we're also seeing potential hops, which would be shipped back up to Canada, being hit by tariffs as well, and that would directly impact the craft brewing industry because really we're the only ones using those hops.
So what are you doing in terms of how you're dealing with those price increases?
That's a good question. We've already been facing, we've just gone through COVID, we've gone through interest rate hikes, we've gone through inflation. It's been a tough journey. So for us, we've already been focusing on and negotiate. The challenge we have as an industry is craft brewers in Canada are taxed much higher than our southern neighbors. Mm-hmm. And then further in Ontario, where we're based, we have among the highest tax in all of North America. So we have been also lobbying the government and we've given them a proposal, which would be a tax neutral proposal. It's just making sure that there's the right balance of taxation for small and medium producers to be actually competitive and have enough margin in our business.
So that's part of the messaging that you're already sending out. I'm just kind of thinking about you're being hit on both ends. You've got price increases to you. We know that consumers, Canadian and American, they're just being very careful with where they spend their money right now. So anything discretionary, which would even include beer, I think, although maybe diehards might argue with that, but it is a discretionary purchase. And I'm wondering if there might be a sales drop or a sales stalemate, on the other end of things affecting you.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. We're trying to absorb as much of these price increases as we can. But again, as we talked about, we're already operating off the leanest margins in North America. So there's only so much we can do. But yes, we're trying to be conscious. We're all consumers. We're all watching how much we spend. So we're trying to find that balance. But beer is an affordable luxury. It's one of those things you might not, book your trip to the U.S., but maybe you'll, have a Canadian IPA. And it's a little pleasures in life, and so we're hoping that there's still the sales don't drop off here.
That raises something else. Have you seen a boost to the positive side because of the Buy Canadian movement, Matt?
It's interesting. For wine and whiskey, yes, they have seen it, but for the categories we're in, we make beer and cider as well as a lot of better-for-you non-alcoholic beverages. Those categories, a lot of our American competitors are co-manufactured up here. So we're seeing in grocery stores, they're all getting the Maple Leafs. My challenge, or our challenge and our message to Canadians is those profits are all going back down to the U.S. They may be getting produced here, but they're spending as little money as they can here to repatriate it to the U.S. So we're really hoping Canadians see past those Maple Leafs there and actually lean into not just Canadian made, but Canadian owned, because those profits stay here, they get reinvested. And the craft beer community is probably, aside from hospitality, the only industry that is in really every small and large community across the country. And so we are a cultural and economic driver. And so we're really hoping to see some support rallied around that.
I'm just wondering, you know, you set this up 2013. You've been in business more than a decade now. I bet you poured your soul into that and watched it grow. A lot of pride in that, for sure.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts as you look to the future, given all the challenges you've told us about?
Yeah, it's luckily we're a group of stubborn and I'd beg to say creative people. So we find solutions through all of this. You know, we have built our company. We support emerging artists from Canada and around the world, with the majority of those artists being Canadian. And we've always featured them on our packaging. So our brand's ever evolving. What products we make evolves with our consumers. So we're continually evolving on that front as well. So hitting COVID, we felt comfortable pivoting where we're all delivery drivers. As we've dealt with inflation and interest rates, we've had to manage our way through it. Doesn't make it easy. Our industry definitely does need help, but we're stubborn and we'll push our way through this.
And let me just ask you quickly to conclude. I've so enjoyed this conversation and really appreciate your showing us around. But you mentioned a couple of times you've already taken the hit in terms of the cans, but there could be more to hops and other things, depending on what Canada's response is. And we know that there are going to be meetings today, once we learn what Donald Trump is now about to launch. There are going to be Canadian meetings, a Canadian response to it. What do you want the leaders, the federal level, to know about retaliation and the kinds of measures they're considering in terms of the impact of business owners like you?
Yeah, I think they really like small and medium business. Every politician talks about we're the backbone of the economy. So they need to really live that talk and really make sure that they're thinking as they apply the tariffs, who they are directly impacting. Putting tariffs on hops coming into Canada because they're proprietary from a specific region. We have contracts, only penalizes craft brewers. You know, we're 10% of the volume, but we're 80% of the jobs in the brewing industry. So, our ask is that they really think through who they are affecting. There's a lot of large American companies, whether it's making products or services or inputs that they could focus on, but really make sure they aren't impacting Canadian small and medium businesses and directly the consumers as well.
Matt, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story and your thoughts. I really appreciate you, and we'll stay in touch and find out how things go.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Matt Johnston at the Collective Arts Brewery. And that leads us into some live political coverage. I want to take you to Toronto. Here is Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre beginning what he is billing as a keynote address to supporters, and we're going to listen in live here on CBC Morning Live.
Unprovoked attacks on our sovereignty. We're left wondering how we can end the paralyzing uncertainty and what the future holds. We don't know what today's tariff announcement will bring, how long they will last, or what they will do. But whatever President Trump does, a bunch of things remain undeniably true. One, these tariffs are unjustified. Two, they will hurt people and businesses on both sides of the border. And three, Canada will obviously never be the 51st state. But we need a plan going forward, a plan that is both strong and effective. And I want to break that down into three parts. Obviously, one, we need an immediate response. Two, we need to tackle the dispute after the election, hopefully to bring it to an end. But three, perhaps most important of all, we need a long-term plan to build our economic fortress in Canada so we are never vulnerable to these kinds of threats again. Tout d'abord, notre réponse doit être immédiate.
First of all, there must be an immediate response. That is why we must impose counter tariffs and target the products that we don't need or that we can buy elsewhere or that we can produce right here in Canada at home in order to discourage economic attacks by the U.S. We also have to work on our response to providing relief to businesses. Our top priority must be to keep jobs here. Once the linkage has been broken between a worker and the employer, it's very hard to restore it. It's far more difficult than keeping that connection there in the first place. And that's why a Conservative government will create a fund to preserve Canadian jobs. It will be a targeted, temporary program and will be aimed at those companies that are directly affected by tariffs in order to maintain employees in their jobs.
Targeted reciprocal tariffs, targeted narrowly at those American goods we don't need, can make ourselves, or buy elsewhere to maximize impact on the Americans while minimizing impact on ourselves. Secondly, we must be prepared to protect jobs. Keeping Canadians working should be our top priority. And that's why we need to focus on maintaining the link. If a worker loses his job, it's much harder, longer, and actually more expensive for the government to try and get him back into employment than it is to try and keep him working in the interim period while this dispute is on. The Conservative government, if elected at the end of this month, will launch a Keeping Canadians Working Fund, a targeted temporary loan program for businesses that are directly hit, helping them keep workers on the job. Very similar to the type of program that John Baird initiated when we were in the Harper government during the great global recession. Binding people to their jobs, keeping their paychecks going while we can get through this trade dispute will help keep the horizon bright and keep our economy stable. But where do we go from there? The second part of the plan is we have to try to end this trade dispute. There's no guarantee, but we have to try. Dès le premier jour de mon mandat comme Premier
On day one
ministre,
of
je vais
my
proposer au
mandate as
président
Prime Minister, I will propose to the President that we accelerate the negotiations to agree on a new trade and security agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. In any case, it has to be renegotiated next year. It's not a matter of if, but when. So why not do that directly and quickly in order to eliminate the tariff uncertainty that is weighing on our workers and our businesses? So we must act to put an end to that chaos.
I will propose to the President to accelerate renegotiations of CUSMA, bringing in a new deal on trade and security. CUSMA must be renegotiated anyway, next year. Why wait? Why not get it done now? Why not end the uncertainty that is paralyzing both sides of the border and that is also costing us jobs today? We should set a firm date to finalize a new deal. And I will propose that both countries pause tariffs while we hammer out that deal. Keeping destructive tariffs in place kills jobs on both sides of the border and so serves no purpose at all. It does not make sense to go on killing jobs, disrupting markets, and weakening both our economies with on-again, off-again tariffs for months on end as Canadian businesses and workers live in paralyzed terror. In the meantime, during negotiations, suspension of tariffs would have to go both ways. Either they take them off or we would not. We would require this to be fully reciprocal as we work towards getting a deal. And as for the deal itself, any good negotiator would tell you that he wouldn't put his cards on the table before sitting down to talk. But Canadians do have a right to know what our red lines are. Donc, premièrement, je vais protéger.
So first of all, I will protect our border, our resources, our farmers, including those who are supply managed. I will also protect our fresh water and our workers in the auto sector. I am also intent on saying that it is absolutely out of the question that we will negotiate our sovereignty. No, our laws, our dollar, our water, our culture, our languages, our natural resources, and our Indigenous rights will remain under our control forever.
Mark Carney and Donald Trump sont unis.
Mark Carney and Donald Trump are united in their opposition to the protection of the French language. Mr. Carney intends to challenge it before the courts. Mr. Trump wants to challenge it in negotiations. The United States does not have the right to dictate the content of our language laws or any other Canadian law. Canada is a proud and sovereign country. That is not negotiable. We will protect our sovereignty. Second, I am pledging to ensure that all revenues collected from a better agreement with the U.S. will fund a better military, stronger and bigger, to protect our sovereignty and expand our presence in the North. We will be able to respect our commitments to NATO, the 2% target, and be a reliable partner to our allies. We must not do that just to please Donald Trump. We have to do it because it is necessary for us to be a strong and sovereign country, that we have a strong, well-funded military. That is the goal of our country, to protect our territory with our own armed forces rather than always depending on the Americans.
As I said, Canadians have the right to know what red lines I will draw in order to protect our country in these inevitable negotiations that any future Prime Minister will have to have, and have quickly. So let me be clear. First, I will protect our control over our border, our security, our resources, our farmers, including our supply-managed farmers, our fresh water, our automotive workers. Also, we will protect our sovereignty, our laws, our currency, our dollar, our land, our waters, our sky, our culture, our official languages, and our resources and Indigenous rights will not be under the control of any other country. This is non-negotiable. We will protect Canada's sovereignty in any negotiations. Second, for years, the Americans have demanded we do more in defense. But the truth is, Canadians have been demanding exactly the same thing. And so I will commit that any extra revenue generated from expanded trade with the United States will go right into our armed forces. We will hit our 2%. We will take back control of our Arctic waters from the Chinese and the Russians. We will rebuild our military, and we'll become a truly sovereign nation with a strong armed forces that can protect us. We will not do this to please President Trump. We will do it because it is right for Canada, especially in light of America's growing ambivalence towards NATO. It is important for Canada to step up and show its strength. Canada will carry its own weight. We will secure the North. We will put more boots on the ground, submarines and ships in the sea, and planes in the air. Americans will be able to sleep sound at night, knowing that we fully defend our North. It will also allow us to improve NORAD, to deter, detect, and destroy incoming threats to our shared security. Third, while we will agree to work with the Americans to secure our border on fentanyl and illegal migration, I'll also demand that they do their part to stop sending illegal guns across our border that kill our people. Now, how do we ensure that President Trump keeps his side of the bargain? How can we trust that he'll honor any new agreement when, let's be honest, he violated the last one, the one he negotiated? Well, That's the situation we're now in. We must make sure that the next deal has commitments that we make on defense, border cooperation, and market access that we can withdraw if and when he decides to break the deal and tariff us again. We will hold up our end of the bargain only as long as he holds up his. That is how we create the leverage to protect against a president suddenly changing his mind and breaking his word. But we can't control what the president does. You know, my father isn't a particularly religious man, but he did teach me the serenity prayer. God help me to accept the things I cannot change, change the things I can, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And we know that we can't control the decisions the president makes, but we know we can control the decisions we make about our own destiny here at home. The president will have a fork in the road. Either he'll continue to hold the threat of tariffs over our heads for the next 3.5 years, or we'll secure a deal that provides permanent relief to our economies, now paralyzed by uncertainty. We don't know which way he'll go. So Canada must be prepared either way. A renewed trade deal with the Americans would be ideal, but it's not the entire solution to our economy. A credible plan to deal with Trump must prepare Canada for growth with or without reliable trade with the Americans. Unfortunately, after the lost Liberal decade, we are in an unprecedented position of weakness. Our economy is stagnant. Our workers are poor. Our industry has been left exposed to President Trump's threats. And let's be clear about this. We have had the single worst growth of any country in the G7 over the last Liberal decade. The worst part of that growth happened while Mark Carney was Justin Trudeau's economic advisor. In fact, our per capita GDP is smaller than it was 5 years ago, while the American per capita GDP has grown by 18%. We are projected to have the slowest growth of all of the nearly 40 OECD nations, and that is after 10 years of the Liberals in power. In the first 14 years of this century, Canada had a net investment of American dollars in Canada of about $30 to $100 billion, depending on the year. Right now, after the last Liberal decade, there are $500 billion more Canadian dollars invested in America than the reverse. $500 billion has poured out of our economy into the U.S. We are more dependent and helpless than ever before, precisely because of the policies that Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau have imposed in this lost decade. Et en ce moment déterminant, les Canadiens doivent poser
In this decisive time, there's a single question for Canadians. Why does Mr. Trump support Mark Carney? Why did he choose Mark Carney as the winner of the next election? Do you think that Donald Trump is really wishing to support Canadian interests? No. Why does he want to negotiate with another Liberal government? Well, does Mr. Trump think he can get more out of Canada? What I think is that President Trump knows that a fourth Liberal term under Mark Carney would weaken our economy even more. He will continue to depend on the U.S. market. Mr. Trump knows that Mr. Carney is claiming to be able to make Canada an energy superpower. He knows as well that Mark Carney will continue to block the construction of pipelines. And in fact, Mark Carney said more than 80% of fossil fuels should remain in the ground.
Have to ask a question. Why is Donald Trump so supportive of Mark Carney? Why has Trump anointed Carney the winner of the next election? Do you think it's because Trump has Canada's best interests at heart when he says that he'd rather negotiate with a Liberal government? Or is he thinking about what he can get at Canada's expense? Here's what I think. Donald Trump knows that a fourth Liberal term under Mark Carney will make Canada even weaker and poorer than it was over the last decade, more dependent on American markets and vulnerable to his threats. He knows Mr. Carney is opposed to turning Canada into an energy superpower. He knows that Liberal agenda blocking energy production and pipeline construction will keep Donald Trump's thumb over our economy. In fact, Mr. Carney actually said, and I'm quoting here, more than 80% of current fossil fuel reserves would need to stay in the ground. Now, obviously, he means Canadian oil reserves. There would be more oil produced south of the border, profiting the Americans and making us weaker and more reliant. Trump knows that Mr. Carney will keep Justin Trudeau's industrial carbon tax on Canadian industry, as well as Trudeau's cap on Canadian energy, driving business south. And just yesterday, Mark Carney gave a wonderful gift to Donald Trump. He announced he will keep the Liberal No New Pipelines Law C-69 in place. Bill C-69 guarantees there will never again be a pipeline, LNG plant, large-scale mine, or nuclear project built in this country. It will send hundreds of billions of dollars fleeing south of the border to Trump's America and force us to continue to sell our oil and gas at massive price discounts. When you consider that Mark Carney's Keep It in the Ground agenda will make us even more dependent on the United States, it becomes pretty clear why Trump wants the Liberals to win a fourth term. The last thing that President Trump wants is a strong Canadian Prime Minister who will turn this country around, turning our country into an economic and resource powerhouse with competitive taxes that is open for business. That might not be good for President Trump, but it is exactly how you put Canada first. The choice in the next election is clear. After the lost Liberal decade, can we afford a fourth term of rising costs and crime and falling economy under America's thumb? Or is it time for a change with a new Conservative government that will put Canada first, a government that will unleash our resources, cut taxes for our workers, bring home our jobs, and stand up to the Americans from a position of strength? That's the decision. That's the decision. And that part we do control. Only we control our natural resources, our tax policy, our competitiveness, and whether Canadians keep more of what they earn and save. The story of Canada is a story of doing big things, of ambitious projects that bind the nation together, uniting us as a people and securing our sovereignty. That's what Brian Mulroney did when he negotiated free trade. That's what John A. Macdonald did with the railway. Canada was not handed to our ancestors. They had to work and sacrifice for it. And whether we were born here or chose to come, we are their heirs. And we have a duty to defend what our ancestors gave us, to build an even better Canada to leave to our children. That is our purpose. That is what we will do. We need our country to think big again. It's time to challenge ourselves, because decline is a choice, but it's not my choice. I choose to build. I choose to grow. I choose to meet the moment with ambition worthy of the men and women who built this great country. My plan for the Canadian economy could not be more different than what you've seen over the lost Liberal decade of Carney and Trudeau. I've spent the first week of this campaign setting out ambitious and detailed plans to build our economy so we can stand on our own 2 feet and stand up against foreign threats. It's everything we should have been doing for the last 10 years, everything I said we should do over the last 10 years, and everything that Mark Carney has explicitly opposed over the last 10 years. Dès la première semaine de ma campagne,
on the day one of my campaign, I proposed a 15% tax cut on the income of regular workers, a tax cut to ensure reinvestment in Canada, no tax on capital gains when you invest your capital gains right here in Canada. And that tax cut will bring in billions of dollars to Canada to build pipelines, mines, buildings, and other projects, major projects that will create jobs and invent technologies. And that will give us the ability to take back control and put our economy back on track. We will allow our seniors to earn up to $34,000 if they decide to work without paying tax, so we stop punishing people who work hard. We will create shovel-ready zones. These are areas where the authorization to build has already been provided so that we can build major projects like railways, pipelines, transmission lines, and other types of essential infrastructure in Canada by bringing our resources to the rest of the world without going through the United States.
I've laid out clear and detailed plans to relaunch our economy and take back control of our economic destiny. I've announced that we will cut income taxes by 15% to reward hard work and give our people a chance to get ahead. I've announced the Canada First Reinvestment Tax Cut. Zero capital gains tax when you reinvest the proceeds building Canada right here at home. Think about this. Think about this right now. There is currently no incentive if you sell an investment today to reinvest it in Canada. You pay the same capital gains tax if you reinvest here versus sending it abroad. And in fact, because the taxes on your later investment are lower abroad, the business taxes and other taxes, there is a perverse incentive to ship money away. And that's why so much investment has left. Then there's the lock-in effect. Countless people hold on to tired old assets that they'd love to dispose of, but would face a walloping tax bill. So instead of disposing of it to someone who can do something better with it and using the proceeds to build new homes, launch a new factory, buy a new CNC machine or a conveyor belt, or launch a new technology, the money just sits dead. That's the lock-in effect. By allowing Canadians to sell existing investments and immediately reinvest it here in Canada, it will be like economic rocket fuel, launching our economy above and beyond the Americans, turning this into a dynamic, free market economy where we can show our strength and reward success. We want to reward hard work. Our seniors are punished if they choose on their own behest to go out and work. They get clawed back and taxed away. We'll let them earn up to $34,000 tax-free so that there's actually a benefit to sharing their wisdom and their contributions with our economy. And we will create Canada shovel-ready zones, areas that are pre-permitted for construction before we even receive an application. The way it will work is that online we will publish the standards and specs required to build power stations, pipelines, LNG plants, and more, but with permits that are already legally binding and granted, so that companies don't have to sit around for 7 years tying up billions of dollars of capital, something that has dissuaded them from being here. After the Liberals killed $178 billion of projects, many companies won't even try. But if they have pre-permitting and absolute certainty, they can get to work and get their shovels in the ground. One of those projects will be the Ring of Fire. I pledge to grant permits for the Ring of Fire within 6 months of becoming Prime Minister. And we'll partner with President Mulroney and the team in the Ontario government to build that road so we can actually move the goods back and forth. I talked to a First Nations chief from up north who wants the Ring of Fire, and I said, "Are the shovels in the ground?" He said, "The snow shovels." He said, "They've been waiting 5 years and spent $50 million on federal permitting for a road. Forget the mine itself. Let's get these delays out of the way. As the great Bob Stanfield said, let's stop stopping and start starting." One example is the 14 biggest energy and resource companies wrote a letter to all of the federal leaders. And they said there's 5 things we need if you want us to make Canada economically independent from the Americans. 5 specific asks. 1, you need to repeal the No New Pipelines Law, C-69, and the tanker ban, so we can ship our oil overseas? My answer? Yes. 2, grant decisions on major projects within 6 months rather than 17 years. My answer? Yes. 3, scrap the energy cap that will limit the amount of oil and gas we can produce while allowing foreign polluting countries to have an unlimited dominance in markets. So scrap the energy cap? My answer? Yes. 4, they said we must axe the industrial carbon tax, which makes it impossible for us to compete with Americans who have no such tax. Axe the industrial carbon tax? My answer is yes. And give Indigenous loan guarantees to help First Nations take equity positions and profit from the projects that happen on their land? My answer, again, is yes. Yesterday in St. John's, I committed to all 5 of these things. Mr. Carney has said he will do none of them. Expanding our energy production and exports is the single most powerful thing we can do to break our dependence on the Americans. And that is the very single thing that Mark Carney has explicitly said he will not do. So what is his plan? A resume is not a plan. Nor is continuing with the same policies that got us into this mess in the first place. In fact, he wants to put the Liberal policies on steroids. His housing plan, I don't know if you saw this earlier this week, he wants to create a government-run construction company that is going to make prefab tiny homes with no parking spots. This is his idea for housing. This is even more radical than the stuff that came from Stephen Guilbeault and Justin Trudeau over the last 10 years. This is not a serious plan to protect our economy and break our dependence. We need a serious nation-building plan to Trump-proof our economy. Mine will put Canada first. It is a plan for Canada that is richer and stronger than the one the Liberals left us. A plan to protect Canada from whatever choices, wrong choices, the President might make. So my message to President Trump is this: if you keep attacking our economy, over the next 4 years, under my Conservative government, Canada will become completely rebuilt as an economy that no longer is reliant on the Americans for everything. You will have lost your greatest trading partner and best friend. We will be a confident and strong country capable of standing on its own 2 feet, standing up to anybody that gets in our way, and moving forward to give our people back the Canadian promise. The only thing we can control is the things that we do at home. And the best way is to unleash our industry, cut taxes on our workers, bring zero capital gains taxes for our Canadian reinvestment, build more pipelines, LNG plants, power plants, data centers. That is the only way to actually stand up to the U.S. President. All these things I've talked about for the last 10 years. All these things Mark Carney has consistently opposed. All of these things are required to move forward. But we have to remember why we're doing these things. The point of these trade and resource and tax policies is not to win a debate in a faculty club or an economic seminar. What use is it to have a booming economy if our cities are unaffordable, unsafe, and increasingly unlivable? Some Liberal supporters and lobbyists have asked why I keep talking about the cost of living, housing, crime, and about the Liberal drug crisis instead of focusing exclusively on Donald Trump. My answer is this: the threat of the President's actions against Canada are serious, and I've proposed serious answers to those threats. But the struggles that Canadians are facing at home, the fear and the hurt that I hear everywhere across this land, those are real too. And I will not stop talking about these problems which predate Donald Trump and which will outlast Donald Trump if we do not act to fix them. Everyone is struggling with the cost of living. Young Canadians are stressed about never affording a home, bills they can't afford. Their parents worry that they might overdose, their children might overdose on fentanyl. And even those who are not afflicted with that scourge wonder how they'll ever move out of their parents' basement and have kids. Millions of Canadians have been living for years in what I call lives of quiet desperation. Their stories rarely make the evening news. So yes, I will be out there every day, outlining my plan to protect Canada against American tariffs. But I will also unapologetically be out there talking about my plan to build more homes, get people off drugs and into recovery, fix the budget, keep inflation down, cap immigration so we never add more people than healthcare, jobs, and housing, get criminals off the street. We can do all of these things. We must do all of these things at the same time as we stand up to President Trump from a position of strength. Because I guess that's what a prime minister does. Now, what the Liberals would like you to do is forget about all the damage they did over the last 10 years. They want you to forget the lost Liberal decade. They want you to forget that it's exactly the same Liberal ministers, same Liberal MPs, same Liberal strategists making the same broken Liberal promises. We cannot afford a fourth Liberal term. We need a change to put Canada first. We will get that change. We will be a strong, self-reliant nation that takes care of its own and bows down before no country. Not a nation of tax collectors and toll masters, of bureaucrats and busybodies, of gatekeepers and grandees, of rulers and rule makers. No, we are a nation of explorers and entrepreneurs, artists and adventurers, workers and warriors, pioneers and patriots. Canada is much more than just not being American. It is about our shared values, our culture, our shared history, and the enduring promise that Canada made to each and every one of us. The promise that brought my wife here as a refugee from Venezuela. Why would she leave a beautiful tropical country to come to a place where it snows in the middle of April? The answer is because this country offered the incredible promise that 6 people crammed into a basement East End Montreal apartment could work their way to a successful life, that she, with that humble beginning, could stand next to the son of a teenage mother adopted by 2 school teachers to be on this stage. We owe it to this country. My family owes this country everything we have, and therefore we have a duty to protect the same promise for those who will come after us. Canada needs a change to restore its promise. Canada is ready for that change. I am ready to lead that change. I am ready to be Prime Minister for our people, for our land, for Canada first, for a change. Let's bring it home. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Fatah. Welcome inside the CBC newsroom. And if you're just joining us, we have been taking you live to Toronto, where the Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, has been making his pitch once again to Canadian voters as to why he should be the next Prime Minister, talking about his values, some of the Conservative policies, his own personal story, that of his wife. But of course, the main story of the day today is what's going to happen in a different country, in the United States, specifically in Washington, D.C., and where President Donald Trump is set to announce his reciprocal tariffs on countries around the world, including on Canada. That is the issue that has dominated much of this election. So for more insight into all of this, let's turn to the host of CBC's The House, Catherine Cullen, who's been listening in, and she joins us now live from Ottawa. Catherine, really good to have you on. Let's talk about what we just heard from Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a couple of things, Natasha. Let's start with the context and actually sort of what we were hearing, and then we can get deeper into some of the policy points that he raised there. I think it's important to note, we've been talking on CBC this morning about this as a keynote address. You may have noticed that the backdrop behind Mr. Poilievre had Conservative slogans on it. This was an event custom created by the Conservatives for Mr. Poilievre to make this speech today. They are dealing with the fact that their primary opponent in this election is Mark Carney, Liberal leader, yes, but also the Prime Minister, and as we've been discussing on CBC News Network today, Mark Carney in Ottawa today, meeting with his council on Canada-U.S. relations. He'll, after Donald Trump's announcement, hold a cabinet committee meeting to talk about part of Canada's plan, the way in which Canada will address these tariffs. So Mark Carney has this incumbency advantage. This event today created to feel like something a little bit different than your typical campaign announcement, perhaps give a bit more of a sense of leadership. But it is a custom event for the Conservatives. The people in that crowd handpicked. The Conservatives insist to me, oh, they're not all Conservatives, that there are business leaders, folks from union backgrounds there, but nonetheless a very friendly crowd for Mr. Poilievre, which I think is important to consider when we see how he's being received.
Catherine Cullen, host of CBC Radio's The House in Ottawa. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Okay, Natasha, actually, if it's all right with you, I think we should just really quickly hit on a couple of the policy points there, if we have a moment.
Yes, of course. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So a couple of things that Mr. Poilievre said there that are significant and new pieces of information from him. One, that he's going to create this fund that will keep, he says, workers attached to their jobs should they lose them over the course of Donald Trump's retaliation, and talking about the significance of that. That's a big plank. I thought it was significant, Mr. Poilievre talking about the fact that he wants to move forward with renegotiation of CUSMA as quickly as possible. He said he would like to have both countries suspend their tariffs and counter-tariffs over the period of that renegotiation. I suspect he will get questions about that because, of course, we know there is possibly no one on planet Earth who loves tariffs quite so much as the self-described tariff man, Donald Trump. So how would he convince Donald Trump to back off on tariffs over this period of renegotiation? Certainly, it would be a good thing for the Canadian economy. Not clear that Mr. Trump would agree to those kinds of terms. He also talked about investing additional revenue from expanded trade with the United States into Canada's military to strengthen Canada's military. A very live question right now for Canada, for the Canadian economy, is, expanded trade with the United States. Under which circumstances would such a thing be possible? Both the Liberal leader and the Conservative leader are talking about getting more of Canada's resources to market, the possibility of that being a way to sort of juice Canada's economy. But the question of how much of that would go to the United States is very much a live one, given how touchy the relationship is right now. So there certainly were new policy planks there today. I think a speech intended to be an important one for Mr. Poilievre as he tries to meet the moment, knowing that public opinion polls are suggesting that a lot of people are looking to Mark Carney. A lot of voters are looking to Mark Carney and his experience, the fact of this incumbency advantage, and perhaps many Canadians preferring what the Liberals had to offer. And you heard a pointed retort to that from Mr. Poilievre, where he talked about a resume not being a plan. So a little bit of pushback against what is seeming to be an advantage in this election for Mr. Carney, which is his background as a central bank governor and dealing with, as Mr. Carney has said numerous times, more than one crisis in the past.
Okay, and is there anything else we need to cover, Catherine?
I think that'll do for now. Thanks, Natasha.
No, thanks so much, Catherine Cullen, joining us from Ottawa. And folks, just a reminder that we will go back to Toronto for live coverage as soon as Pierre Poilievre starts taking questions from reporters. They are setting up that scene. We'll take you there live when it gets underway. But let's keep talking about the big story of the day, because there is deep uncertainty right across the globe today, but there's also defiance. Canadians, along with anxious investors, manufacturers, and consumers in countries everywhere, are watching for that huge announcement from the White House Rose Garden that's coming this afternoon. You see, at 4 p.m. Eastern, U.S. President Donald Trump, as you know, is going to announce the details of what he calls Liberation Day, a raft of what's being described as reciprocal tariffs on Canada and all countries that trade with the United States. Liberal Party leader Mark Carney is off the election campaign trail today, as Catherine was just telling us, resuming his prime ministerial duties and meeting with advisors to plan Canada's response. Now, whatever Trump says, it is certain to have an impact on the federal election. We have extensive coverage for you on all of this over the course of the day right here on CBC News Network, including special programming setting up Trump's announcement, which is going to begin at 3 p.m. Eastern. So let's turn now to CBC's Katie Nicholson, who's joining us from Washington. Katie, we're already seeing some movement in the U.S. tariffs ahead of Donald Trump's announcement. What can you tell us in terms of details?
Well, let's just start with the pause on the first round of tariffs, the 25% on goods. You're going to remember that the U.S. agreed to suspend tariffs on CUSMA-compliant businesses until April 2nd. Well, that's today. So what happens? Ottawa-based international trade lawyer William Pellerin said that that exemption that had been giving Canadian businesses some breathing room and all of this chaos, unless it is renewed today, those tariffs are likely going to come into effect. Here's William Pellerin.
Proving that CUSMA origination was a very, very big deal and allowed companies over the last few weeks to save vast amounts of tariffs and continue to ship to the United States duty-free. It is that exemption that is now lifted that is going to cause a lot of harm in the coming days unless it's renewed, and we'll learn more about that from the Rose Garden this afternoon.
Okay, so supposing those tariffs come into full effect, then you've got the auto tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, energy tariffs, whatever is announced today in the Rose Garden at 4 o'clock. How will all of that accumulate? Is it going to stack up and hit the Canadian economy? That's a very big question today for Mark Carney in his role as Prime Minister, as he and the team adjust their response. And of course, he is going to be in afternoon meetings with his U.S.-Canada relations teams. And of course, today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford out on CNBC appealing again to an American audience, cautioning how this will damage both countries. Here's Premier Ford.
President Trump's attacking their number one ally, their number one customer. And it's going to be unfortunate. He calls it Liberation Day. I call it Termination Day because people are going to be losing their jobs across the U.S.
So remember, yesterday, the White House confirmed that whatever it is that is going to be announced today at 4 o'clock, those tariffs are supposed to be effective immediately. And that is really a stunning assertion because we don't know how these tariffs are going to be structured. Are they talking about customized tariffs for specific countries, a flat rate on imports? Just consider this for a second. The U.S. imports about $3.2 trillion of goods every year. So think about just the sheer logistics of implementing something like that so quickly and on so many products. And what are the markets going to do? What's the response? What are the retaliatory plans that we're going to hear from trading partners, from Canada, from Mexico, China, the European Commission also talking tough? And beyond all of this further market volatility, this is expected to spark fears that, these new tariffs could further weaken the U.S.'s frayed relations with other countries, just depending on how big and wide-ranging they are. Senator Peter Welch from Vermont was also on CNBC this morning, speaking to the concerns that he's hearing from the business community on just how there's no clear path to try and get carve-outs for whatever it is that's coming down. Here's a little bit of that.
This is one of the problems. When I talk to our businesses, they want to know how can they get a carve-out, right? A fair question. Well, it turns out, I think, that it's who you know. Do you know Ludwig? Do you know Besson? So there's going to be this situation where it's going to feel to our businesses very arbitrary, and where that quality that businesses need, stability, certainty, is ripped out from underneath them.
So there's quite a bit of fear, anxiety, chaos, and then there are the effects at home, just kitchen table stuff. So the Yale Budget Lab estimates that this plan could end up costing the average American consumer anywhere from $2,700 to $3,400 a year. And this is coming right at that moment when consumer confidence is plummeting and people are spending less. And for that, you can bet there will be some sort of political price to pay.
Well, Katie, it's interesting because later on in the show, we're going to be speaking to someone from the Yale Budget Lab, so I'll be looking forward to their analysis as well. But, we've talked about this pushback from some Senate Democrats and a handful of Republicans who are supportive as well in terms of challenging the tariffs that are coming directly at Canada. So I want to play for you a clip of Senator Tim Kaine when he was speaking yesterday, because he really has been leading the charge on this.
These tariffs against Canada, our number one trade partner, an ally and friend, make absolutely no sense. The stated reason for the emergency, that there's a fentanyl crisis of fentanyl coming into the United States from Canada, is invented and specious.
So we know the senators planned on presenting that challenge yesterday. What exactly is the latest on that?
Yeah, it was pushed over today because of a record-breaking filibuster on the Senate floor, but it is on the schedule for this afternoon, should be up for debate and a vote. So Kane really does have backing from at least one Republican Senator, Rand Paul, who co-sponsored the measure, and there are other senators from states with tight geographic or economic ties to Canada who are signaling they may support it. So it is going to be interesting to watch. All of the Democrats, of course, would have to vote in favor plus 4 Republicans. They just need 4 Republicans. And then it would eventually be voted down likely in the Republican majority House. But what is interesting is that Donald Trump is really pressuring the Republicans publicly to fall in line. He doesn't want them to rain on his tariff parade in the Rose Garden this afternoon. So he's posting on Truth Social overnight this message that's really name-checking the Republican senators that he's clearly worried about. So Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Rand Paul, just really urging them to get back on the Republican bandwagon. Here's a little bit of what he says in one of the posts. Fight the Democrats' wild and flagrant push to not penalize Canada for the sale into our country of large amounts of fentanyl by tariffing the value of this horrible and deadly drug in order to make it more costly to distribute and buy. And he goes on to say that the bill isn't going to go anywhere because the House will never approve it, and I, as your president, will never sign it. Why are they allowing fentanyl to pour into our country unchecked and without penalty? So I just want to highlight again that last week a U.S. intelligence report didn't mention fentanyl from Canada as a serious foreign threat to the United States. That aside, this will be a really fascinating debate and vote to watch, and really to see whether or not these senators cave to pressure from the president and fall in line, or if they're going to make a statement and oppose these tariffs on what is a very big and important day, clearly, to President Donald Trump.
CBC's Katie Nicholson in Washington. Thank you, Katie. And before we head to break, a reminder that CBC News has special coverage of Trump's tariff announcement later on in the day. Chief correspondent Adrian Arsenault will host the programming, along with Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton and Power and Politics host David Cochran. Our coverage begins at 3 p.m. Eastern. That's noon on the West Coast, right here on CBC News Network. We'll be back in just a moment. As we continue our look ahead to U.S. President Donald Trump's big announcement on tariffs later today, we want to take you to Windsor, Ontario. It's often called Canada's auto capital. The Stellantis assembly plant is located there, as well as 2 Ford engine plants and many other auto-related manufacturers. CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick is live inside Windsor City Hall, gauging the pulse on what is potentially a huge day for that city. Megan, people there are anxiously awaiting what Donald Trump is going to say later on in the day. What are you hearing from the mayor?
Yeah, a lot of anxiety and just waiting, Natasha, to finally hear the details from President Donald Trump about his tariff plan. He calls today Liberation Day, and the mayor of Windsor is saying it will be liberation in the sense that finally he and others in this city will be free from the uncertainty that they have been dealing with for weeks, not knowing exactly what this tariff plan will look like. And Drew Dilkin saying this has been a frustrating couple of weeks for him, and he is worried. He is worried about the impact of these tariffs on his community. Windsor, of course, depends heavily on the auto sector, thousands and thousands of jobs because of the plants here and the smaller companies that supply parts to the major plants here. And Drew Dilkin saying these tariffs will not just hit his community, but have a ripple effect throughout the province and the country, really, but also stretching over the border into the United States as well and impacting people there and the auto sector on the other side of the river from where we are, just across the river from Detroit. But as for how it will impact Windsor itself, here's a little bit of what the mayor said he's bracing for.
It could be catastrophic, and we've said that from the very beginning. So a tariff, the 25% was the original number that was proposed. It would have an immediate impact on the auto industry and the parts sector here in the city of Windsor and throughout Essex County, but that would ripple all the way throughout Ontario. It would ripple all the way into the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And so I'm concerned about my community and the job loss in my community, but I'm also reassured by the fact that if it hits my community, it's going to hit the United States, and that's where the president is going to feel the economic pain.
So potentially, depending on how this plays out, Natasha, if those American citizens are feeling the economic pain, Drew Dilkin saying perhaps that is what will convince Donald Trump to lift these tariffs if and when he does put them into place, which is what is widely expected later this afternoon. So again, Drew Dilkin saying they are going to be listening carefully and looking for finally some certainty as to what these tariffs look like so that Windsor and beyond and Canada can then react and plan accordingly and know what they're dealing with.
You know, Windsor is so special in that it's a border city. There's this huge automotive industry there. So many workers are so intertwined with what's happening in the United States. So have you had a chance to speak to any of them, and what are they telling you?
Mm-hmm. Yesterday, we met with Chad Lawton. He has worked at the Ford engine plant for more than 30 years. He also works for the union, Unifor, representing those workers. His wife works there. His two sons work there. So long ties to the auto industry. And he says in terms of the mood in the plant right now, he just said there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. People are worried about losing their jobs. The older workers are worried about their retirement. The younger workers are wondering if they're going to have a future in this industry. But he also says there is a sense of determination and resolve that they will not let their jobs leave this city. He even told me, Natasha, that no equipment will leave his plant. Basically, he said that equipment would leave the plant over his dead body. The union, the workers here are preparing to fight to keep their jobs. Here's more of what Lawton told me.
The reality is, if push comes to shove and we have to fight for it, we will. And I think that there's a growing sentiment as this becomes real for many people that were hoping that it was going to go away on its own or we would talk our way through it, that these are Canadian jobs and we'll do what we have to do to protect them.
He envisions how this might play out, Natasha, is that it might be the smaller suppliers that might take the hit first. If they can't shoulder the burden, the cost of those tariffs, and they can't keep producing the parts that companies like Ford need to build those engines, well, then it's going to impact those workers at the Ford plant. If they can't get the parts they need to build the engines, then they're not working. He says those companies might be the first dominoes to fall. So they're also awaiting word from their company as to what might happen. He says they haven't heard much from Ford yet, but he also acknowledged that it's difficult for the company to plan as well when they don't know exactly what's happening. So again, how is this playing out with the workforce? Well, we did stop by the Stellantis plant yesterday and tried to talk to a few workers as they were going into their shifts and coming off their shifts. Here's some of what we heard.
It's scary, that's for sure. I mean, the thing is, with Trump over there, he's changing his mind every 2 seconds. So it's like, You know, one day you think you're working for the next like 3 months, and then the next day it's like, oh, we might be getting laid off like next week. So
we're confused. We don't know what's going to happen, but I mean, we're sticking together. We're going to get through together like we did with COVID and everything else that hit this place. We've survived, and I think we'll survive this too.
Until something actually happens, there's no sense in worrying about it. So that's all I have to say, really.
There are rumors going around, though. Some of those workers were telling me about possible layoffs, maybe even as early as next week. But again, they're rumors, so lots of talk on the plant floor with those workers talking to each other and wondering what might happen and if their jobs are safe. And what we were hearing, Natasha, is that everyone pretty much here in this city of Windsor will be watching that news conference with President Donald Trump later this afternoon very carefully.
CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Windsor, Ontario. Thank you, Megan. And as we've been saying, the focus today is on Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs, but there's also other levies under his plan that are moving forward. For example, his auto tariffs are set to take effect just after midnight tonight. And it doesn't just affect vehicles. Tires are also going to be hit. Did you know that in Nova Scotia, that's a huge concern because tires are the province's largest export to the U.S.? I definitely didn't know that. I bet you Brett Ruskin did. And he's joining us now live from the Michelin plant in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, one of 3 in the province. So, Brett, what can you tell us about the tire industry in Nova Scotia and what the tariffs and that the ones that are already going to come into effect, what they mean for the province's economy?
Natasha, it's a great trivia question. What's the top export from Nova Scotia? It's not fish, it's not lobster. That's around $1.2 billion. Nova Scotia exports seafood to the United States. $1.5 billion worth of rubber tires goes down to the United States at plants or from plants like the one you see behind me right here. This is one of 3 Michelin plants that are here in Nova Scotia. They employ around 4,000 people, support thousands of other jobs in various communities across the province. And again, $1.5 billion worth of tires goes down to the south to the United States, counts for around 1% of Nova Scotia's overall GDP. So they are watching very closely. Provincial officials certainly are watching tonight, or they will be watching this afternoon's tariff announcement very, very closely to see how it might be impacted, this cornerstone economically of Nova Scotia's overall GDP, of Nova Scotia's overall economy. Yes, fish is important. Yes, seafood is important. Forestry sector is important. But on top of all of that, it is rubber tires, surprisingly, that Michelin quietly goes along and goes about its business here, again, employing thousands of Nova Scotians, all of them relying on that American market. Natasha.
CBC's Brett Ruskin in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. Thank you, Brett. Well, the past few months have been a saga of frustration and uncertainty for Canadians in the wake of U.S. President Donald Trump's ongoing tariff threats. Delays, exemptions, and additions all might become clear at the White House later on today when President Trump is announcing his Liberation Day. Marianne Demain is here with a reminder. I don't know how you're going to do this, but how we got to this point.
And that's why so many Canadians who may not be watching every single day, every single minute, they may be confused. So many things are changing, numbers are changing, dates are changing, and we're also waiting for more details to be unveiled today. But let's go back to how this all started. March 4th on your calendar, that's when President Donald Trump unleashed that first wave of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. There was a pause on certain products, though, that qualify under CUSMA, that is Canada's free trade agreement. There was also a levy limited to 10% on Canadian energy, as well as critical minerals, and potash. That all actually expired today. But in response, Canada put those counter tariffs in place, $30 billion. March 12th is when we saw that levy on Canadian aluminum and steel. Again, there was a counter tariff from Canada, $29.8 billion. And so on and so forth it goes. And again, we're looking forward to see what other details come up from the White House today.
Marianne, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we do need to go to Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP, who is speaking now, going to offer another policy platform. Let's take a listen.
Today is the day that Donald Trump's going to impose his tariffs on us. It's a day that Donald Trump's attacking our workers. And so we've got a message to Donald Trump. New Democrats and workers are going to fight back and defend our jobs and our country. We're ready to fight back. You know, Donald Trump is attacking not just our country, attacking our workers and our very way of life. He wants us to compromise our values. He wants to compromise in who we are. We will not compromise. We will not back down. We will not give up, and we will win this fight. You know, Donald Trump represents a storm. He's an arsonist. He's setting fire to the economy, his own economy, and ours as well. He represents a storm. And in that storm, in that difficult time, Canadians know how to weather a storm. Canadians know how to get through a difficult time. And we do that by looking out for each other. We do that by supporting each other. We do that by taking care of our neighbors. That's what we do as Canadians. The way we fight back against Donald Trump is doubling down on who we are as Canadians and our value, that we are better off and we are stronger when we look out for one another. Now you're going to hear a lot from Mark Carney talking about how he knows how the world works. Well, in his world, the way he thinks the world works and the way the world should work is giving big tax giveaways to those at the very top, asking you and your family to make sacrifices, to tighten your belt, to compromise, to give up. He thinks the way the world works is that big corporations like his former company should buy up affordable homes and then jack up the rent on hardworking families. I think that's wrong. He thinks the way the world should work is that you should sacrifice, but those at the top should make all the money they want. I think that's wrong. And Pierre Poilievre thinks that you weather a storm on your own. Fend for yourself. He believes in cutting the services that people need, cutting childcare, cutting health care. He thinks that you should cut workers' rights. I think that is fundamentally wrong. Here's what we believe. In this difficult storm, we got to look out for one another. That's a Canadian value. And the way we do that is, first and foremost, by standing up for Canadian workers, by supporting unionized workers, by supporting these great folks that are behind me. That's the first thing. And while I'm at it, I got to say a thank you to LIUNA for being the host, but there are so many unions that are here today. I want to thank each and every one of the members that are here. You're who we're fighting for, and having you here standing with me means the world to me, because you're exactly who we should be putting first and foremost in every decision we make. It should be about workers first, about people first. So the first thing we got to do to make sure that we weather this storm is by protecting workers. So if a worker is impacted, if you're in a trade-sensitive sector where tariffs are going to impact you, you need to know that we've got your back. So New Democrats are going to make sure that EI covers enough of your salary so you can keep your home, you can pay your bills, that we've got your back. That's my commitment to you. We also need to build a strong economy in our own country. We can't control what Donald Trump's doing. We're going to fight back and defend our country, but we also have to invest in our country. And that means investing in our workers. Let's invest in creating good jobs here in Canada, using Canadian content, Canadian workers to build the infrastructure we need. If we're going to build roads, bridges, homes, let's use Canadian content and Canadian workers, and let's favor unionized workers in all those projects. We also know that the threat of Donald Trump in this trade war means that the cost of things, which are already so expensive, might go up even higher. And so we've got to be there for families to protect them against that. So I propose a couple of things to do that. First off, let's take the GST off of essentials on your monthly bills, like your internet, your home heating, your cell phone services. Let's take the GST off of those essentials and save people some money. And then I know the cost of groceries is something that is really stressful for so many people. So what we're proposing is putting a cap on grocery essentials to bring down the price of those essentials that families need. Yep. That's right. And finally, New Democrats are going to fight to make sure that the things that we hold dear, the things that are important to you and your family, are never on the negotiating table, starting with labor rights. We should never back down and give up on labor rights, on the rights of workers. We're never going to let healthcare, our universal public healthcare, ever be on that negotiating table. We're not going to let Indigenous rights, our natural resources, our environment, all the things that we hold dear, we're not going to concede. We're not going to give up on those things. And so I want to put to you, the important question in this election. In this election, you're going to have a really important choice. When this storm that Donald Trump represents hits our country, who do you want in Ottawa fighting for you? Who do you want there to say, no matter what, I'm going to put working people first. I'm going to put everyday families first. I say to you that in this fight, you need to re-elect your New Democrat MPs and elect more New Democrats who are going to fight for you and your family every single day in Ottawa. Merci mes amis, je suis tellement honoré d'être ici.
I'm really honored to be here today with the unions and the workers. And I want to begin by thanking LAUNA for welcoming us to this center. And I also want to thank all the other unions that are represented here. I want to also thank Leela Dance and Nikki Ashton, who is our candidate in Northern Manitoba. I want to thank them both for being here. Today we're talking about Donald Trump's threats. Today is the day when Donald Trump will impose tariffs on our country. This is an attack on our country, on our economy, and on our workers. And that's why I'm proud to be here with workers today, because for us, the priority must be workers, people, not billionaires. And what we're ready to do is resist Trump's attacks. And Canadians' resistance is based on our values. For example, that we can face up to that threat if we look after each other. That is a critical value for Canadians and a critical value for New Democrats. It's that idea that we have to look out for each other. We will hear the other parties talking about their vision for the country. Mark Carney will talk about tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. He's already announced those cuts. At the same time, he says there should be cuts to services for everyday Canadians. I think he has the wrong vision for this country. That will not work. And Pierre Poilievre is saying that in these tough times, You have to fend for yourselves. He's saying he'll cut the services you need, healthcare services, dental care, and protections for workers. Also, again, I think that's the wrong thing to do. So in these tough times, what are we proposing? First, that we need to protect workers. We must prioritize workers, and in order to do that, we have to improve employment insurance so that we can protect people in the face of these Trump tariffs. We should also be investing more to create good jobs in Canada, good jobs that are unionized to protect our economy so that we can invest more in our economy and have an economy that's more resilient, where we build using Canadian products and using Canadian workers, and particularly unionized workers. And we also have to bring down the cost of living, because we know that with Trump's threats, there's been an increase in the cost of living at a time when the cost of living is already too high. So our proposal is to remove the GST on essential items every month and to cap grocery essentials. And finally, there will be discussions and negotiations. And for the NDP, it is essential that we defend those things that we hold dear as Canadians, that Quebecers hold dear. New Democrats will never put on the bargaining table Quebec culture, never on the table the French language, never on the table labor rights, never on the table health care, never on the table women's rights, and never on the table anything that we hold dear. And finally, I want to say that in this election, the choice is really about who will fight for you, not for billionaires, not for rich CEOs, but with the threat that Trump represents, who's going to do what helps you? And that is the NDP. So re-electing NDP MPs and sending to Ottawa new NDP MPs will help us in the fight.
We've just learned recently that Mark Carney's former company, Brookfield Investments, that 4 out of 5 of the companies were registered to a small office above a bike shop in Bermuda. Now, I'll give it to you. The name of the town is Hamilton, but I think Mark Carney got the Hamiltons mixed up, because this was in Bermuda, not actually in Ontario. And it shows you, though, that the majority of their companies being registered in Bermuda, the only reason for doing that is to avoid paying taxes in Canada. And you operate in Canada, you have a company that operates here, makes money here. The reason that you're putting your company registered in a foreign country is to avoid paying taxes. But what does that mean for Canadians? Well, it means less money for healthcare. It means less nurses and doctors and frontline healthcare workers. It means less services. It means less in the face of the crisis of Donald Trump to protect workers. It means less for our country. And so can this person who's made a decision to give less contributions, less investments to our country on purpose, be the guy that's actually going to defend workers in this difficult time? I don't think so. Donc, je veux dire que, on a appris que
So we have learned that Mark Carney, as chair of Brookfield Investments, decided to have 4 of their 5 companies registered to an office in Bermuda. And the only reason for that was to avoid paying tax. And what does that mean? Less taxes means fewer investments in healthcare, fewer investments in recruiting healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, and healthcare professionals. It means fewer services for you. It means fewer investments in tough times, such as the ones we're in now. So is Mark Carney someone who will really fight for you when, as the director of a company, he didn't want to pay tax? I don't think so.
On va passer à la période de questions des médias. Une question et une relance. We'll now take the questions from the press. One question, one follow-up. On va commencer avec Juliane Lapointe, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, Monsieur Singh.
Hello, Mr. Singh. On tariffs, in terms of a government response, what would you like to see concretely? And should it be dollar for dollar retaliatory tariffs? Yes, I think it should be dollar for dollar. We have to show our strength, and I've said this before, but I'll repeat. I think it's important to say that I'm on Team Canada in this trade war. I want Canada and workers to win. In terms of Canada's domestic response, that's where I want to say once again that we have to prioritize workers, not billionaires. We have to prioritize everyday Canadians and not rich CEOs. And that's our offer to Canada and to Canadians.
Yeah, so when it comes to the tariff response, I think we need to show strength and have a dollar-for-dollar response to the tariffs. But I've said this before, and I want to say this again, it's important to say, when it comes to how we as a nation deal with the United States, I'm on Team Canada. I want us to win. I think we need to show united front and we stand together. When it comes to our internal response, our domestic response, that's where I'm going to be critical of the other parties and point out, for me, our response domestically has to put workers first, has to put people first, not the billionaires and not the rich CEOs.
Quand vous dites que vous
When you
êtes
say
équipe Canada,
that you're on Team Canada,
d'une certaine façon indirectement,
in a way, is that not an indirect show of indirect support for the Liberals? No, it's just the idea of solidarity. When you're facing a foreign government, I don't think it's right to be attacking ourselves. And in terms of our challenge with the United States and against Donald Trump, I think we need to be together, united. I can criticize domestic responses and make suggestions, but at the same time, we need to be united against the threat from Donald Trump.
No, not at all. I think when it comes to the way we fight back against a foreign country, we do need to show solidarity. We do need to be united. I will be critical about responses when it doesn't stand up to the task for putting workers first or supporting working people and everyday families. I'll be critical about that. I will put forward my suggestions about the way we respond, but the way we stand up to Donald Trump is by standing together, unified as one country that wants to defend the people of this nation against those threats.
Thank you very much. Now Rachel Aiello, CTV.
Hi. Yeah, following up on your Bermuda Brookfield comments based on CTV News reporting, the Liberals promised to crack down on this exact practice in 2021, but you never forced them to do it through the powers that you had in the arrangement that you had between the two parties. Why didn't you?
We absolutely did push back and say they needed to crack down on this, but it became clear that the Liberals were not ready to do that. It's simply not a priority for them. There's many things that we tried to force them to do that they simply would not do. This is an example of the difference between us and them. We believe that everybody in our country should be paying their fair share. And when hardworking people are filling out their taxes, we're in tax season, and they see that a company that makes massive profits in Canada decides to register in a foreign country, they're like, well, I can't do that. I can't just change my address and make my address Bermuda and not pay my taxes. And what does it say about the person that was the chair of that company? It says that they think, that Mark Carney thinks it's okay to not contribute to the Canadian economy. It means it's okay not to support families. It's okay not to invest in the healthcare that we need. It shows you that he doesn't have the right priorities. And it shows you that as a party, the Liberals have let you down. They didn't change this. They allowed this to happen. It's a loophole that they could have closed, that we made very clearly was a priority that should have been done. They didn't do it.
You did have other priorities, other red lines in that deal where you really went to the wire on and forced them to move.
We will continue
Why not
to
on this
monitor
one?
the questions and answers for Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP, who is speaking to reporters right now in Winnipeg, continuing on with his campaign in this federal election, addressing a number of issues, not least of which, of course, the looming reciprocal tariffs that are going to hit several countries, including Canada, from President Donald Trump later on in the day when we get further information on that. But really emphasizing from his point of view that any response needs to focus on jobs and on workers first, not on CEOs and not on billionaires. And I should let you know, I promise that we are going to take the full question and answers from reporters to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party. We were showing that to you live on the screen, but because all the events are happening at similar times, you can only show you one at a time. We will show you that in its entirety in just a moment. But just to round out the circle with Kate McKenna, who is listening in from Ottawa to what we were hearing from the NDP leader, the standout points for you, Kate?
Well, certainly a very strong pro-worker message from Jagmeet Singh, not only in what he was saying, but also he was surrounded by unionized workers while giving his speech. And we also heard off the top a strong message of solidarity, a push for Canadians to come together and stay strong in the face of these threats. He reiterated some of what we've already heard from him when it comes to Donald Trump's tariff threats, specifically that moving forward, Canada should be using Canadian labor, Canadian materials when we're building big infrastructure projects, calls to make sure that EI, employment insurance, is sufficient to cover people's salaries in the effect that they are affected by the trade dispute. And also, as you pointed out, saying that workers need to be considered in every consideration as lawmakers, as Canadian officials move forward in what they're planning to do next. Now, he was with two of his MPs from Manitoba. Nikki Ashton was one, and Leila Dance was the other one. And he's really working to get a foothold into this discussion about tariffs because, you know, the NDP at this time are not polling in a way that they are likely to form government. And so getting a foothold in this conversation can present a challenge for Jagmeet Singh because he is not likely to be the person who is squaring off with Donald Trump in just a few weeks. But there he was saying that an NDP voice is the best voice you can have to be fighting for you, where you is sort of like not billionaires, everyday people. And that was the message that he put out on this day where everyone is going to be talking about Donald Trump's tariff threats.
CBC's Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome.
Now, as promised, let's go to Toronto and bring you Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre taking questions from reporters.
If not, why not? Thank you very much. So I've been operating with the rule of one Prime Minister at a time. Though I disagree strongly with both Prime Ministers Trudeau and Carney, they occupy that office. And I've been very careful not to do anything to divide Canada's voice when communicating with the executive branch of the United States government. And so that's why I have not contacted anyone in the U.S. executive administration. I'm doing my homework, and I built a plan. And that's the plan that I laid out here today. And that plan breaks down into three parts. One is to immediately retaliate with targeted tariffs against the Americans that will maximize impact on them while minimizing it on us, all while we give liquidity to businesses to keep their workers working. Two, work to bring, after the election, a rapid end to this dispute by concluding an economic and security deal that protects our independence and sovereignty, gives us tariff-free access, and allows us to rebuild our military so that the Americans can have confidence that we are carrying our own weight. And then three, of course, the most important part is to build an economic fortress here in Canada. After the lost Liberal decade of rising costs and crime and a falling economy under America's thumb, we can't afford to give them a fourth term. We need to put Canada first for a change with a new Conservative government that will axe taxes, build homes, unleash production to bring home our jobs and make us strong as we stand up against the Americans. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Je suis la règle un premier ministre à la fois.
I follow the rule of one Prime Minister at a time. Obviously, I don't agree with Justin Trudeau's and Mark Carney's policies. Higher taxes, inflation, high housing costs. But they are prime ministers right now. So I don't think we should divide our voice and our connections to the White House by myself having direct contact with the executive. I think for the next few weeks, it is up to the Liberal Prime Minister to be in contact with the White House. I'm doing my homework, and of course, I have presented a plan today. There are three parts to that plan. First, we must retaliate with counter tariffs that target products that we don't need or that we can manufacture ourselves or buy elsewhere. Two, offer loans to preserve jobs in Canadian businesses during the trade war. And, of course, we need to put an end to this chaos by negotiating an agreement with the United States to eliminate tariffs, protect our sovereignty, and make a commitment to rebuild our military, to reassure the Americans that we're doing our fair share when it comes to the defense of the continent. And finally, the most important thing,
en bon Québécois, être maître chez nous.
We must be masters in our own home. We must eliminate taxes, cut taxes, greenlight major projects to bring back production to Canada, so that we can confront the Americans from a position of strength. That is our goal, and that is how we will be able to preserve our sovereignty, our economic sovereignty, our energy sovereignty, and our national sovereignty for the future.
Jacob Lawrence with Bloomberg News. You mentioned the Keeping Canadians Working program. Can you just give us a bit more detail on how much money you want to see go towards this, who's going to qualify, over how many years, that kind of thing?
Yes, it's a very good question. And the unfortunate answer right now is it depends. The smaller the tariffs, the smaller the fund. The bigger the tariffs, the bigger the fund. What we will do is use EDC, the Export Development Bank, the Export Development Corporation, and BDC. These are two lending bodies that already exist, and they have legal powers to lend to Canadian enterprises. We'll authorize them immediately to free up loans to businesses that have been directly hit by the tariffs. And the purpose of the loans will be to keep workers working. We did something similar during the great global recession of 08-09, and it allowed businesses to keep the link with their workers. Like I said, we'll find out later today how big and how wide the tariffs will be, and we will adjust the size and scope of this Keeping Canadians Working loan program accordingly. Thank you.
En français.
Merci beaucoup. Malheureusement, la
Thank
réponse
you very
est que
much.
ça dépend.
The answer is that it depends. We don't know what President Trump will do today. If he proposes more substantive tariffs, our response will be more substantive as well. If it's more targeted, then our loans will be more targeted. It will be directly aimed at businesses that are hit by the tariffs. So this is not a general program, it's a targeted program with a single aim, which is to keep our workers in their jobs. Because when the worker-employer attachment or connection is broken, it can take months or years to restore it. So it's better to keep it in place. That is the goal of this particular approach. So we'll see what the president does, but we must protect jobs after the lost Liberal decade, where costs and crime are up, our economy is slowing, our dependence on Americans is worse, so we cannot elect them to a fourth term. We need a new Conservative government that will put Canada first by strengthening our economy right here at home.
Next question.
Oh, ça va dépendre
Well, it will depend on the magnitude of the tariffs. So I imagine tomorrow morning we'll be able to do an analysis, and if it's a very targeted response that from President Trump, we can also be more targeted. If it's very wide, if there are dozens of industries that are affected, that will require a wider response and a wider program. So we are looking forward to finding out what the President will do. I hope he'll do nothing to attack us. I hope he will leave us alone and just continue to do business with us as we've done for decades. But we will respond once we have the details.
Yeah, Brian Lilly, Toronto Sun. I know you've made some comments about Mr. Carney taking some of your policies. Maybe you caught yesterday, parts of his speech started to sound like parts of yours. Yeah. For voters looking at this, though, they hear him talk about responding to tariffs. They hear you talk about responding to tariffs, about making sure the Canadian economy is resilient. Outside of Bill C-69, which you made clear yesterday, it would not repeal, and you made clear you would. Outside of that, how are voters supposed to look at both of you and say, okay, how are they different? Who has the best plan? Because often things are sounding similar based on how each of you are speaking. So what's the difference?
Well, sincerity, for one. Mr. Carney opposed all of these policies for 10 years as part of the Liberal government. I mean, look, he advised Trudeau to print money and run up huge deficits that drove inflation. He opposes pipelines and energy production here in Canada. His policy on housing is the same as Trudeau's, building up monstrous bureaucracies in Ottawa. His latest is a $35 billion government construction company, which is going to build prefab tiny homes with no driveways. What could possibly go wrong? Building up housing bureaucracies in Ottawa has doubled housing costs during the lost Liberal decade. And giving Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney a fourth term will only make it worse. Then there's crime. Mark Carney supports the entire radical catch-and-release, hug-a-thug criminal justice policy that has turned our streets into war zones in many of our biggest cities. He supports the distribution of tax-funded drugs, and he continues to stand by the entire Liberal agenda of the last decade. If you want to know what the Liberals will do with a fourth term, look what they did with the last 10 years. If you want to know what I'll do, look what I've been saying for the last 10 years. It hasn't changed. I have said exactly the same thing for the last 10 years, and it turns out that the things we must do to counter Donald Trump are all the things I said we should be doing before he even threatened the tariffs. We need to repeal the No New Pipelines Law, C-69. We need to cut taxes on workers. We need to allow tax-free reinvestment of capital gains in Canada. We need to take taxes off new homes so that we can employ our trades workers in a field that doesn't require the Americans, that is to say, building homes on our own soil. We need to secure our streets and lock up the criminals to bring home safety. In essence, what we need after a lost Liberal decade is not a fourth term. What we need is a new government that will put Canada first for a change.
En français.
Excuse me. Merci beaucoup, Brian.
Thank you very much, Brian. The difference is sincerity. Mr. Carney supported all the Liberal policies and has so all throughout that lost Liberal decade. It's the same Liberal ministers, the same Liberal MPs, the same Liberal strategists with the same Liberal promises. So they will never do anything different if they have a fourth term compared to what they've done over the last 3 terms. On the contrary, I'm saying exactly the same thing now that I've been saying for 10 years. I have always said that we have to cut taxes and reward work, remove trade barriers, and generate more energy here, including through LNG Quebec. Eliminate taxes on Canadian investments so that we can rebuild and strengthen our economic fortress here in Canada. So that's the same thing I've been saying throughout that time. So the choice for Canadians after a lost Liberal decade is, are we going to re-elect the same Liberals, give them a fourth term, or are we going to make a change and put Canada first with a new Conservative government?
Final question.
Bonjour, Monsieur Poilievre.
Bonjour.
Hello,
Mr. Poilievre. Recently, you said that you intend to fight woke ideology in universities. You talked about funding of scientific researchers. What led to this? Well, I think universities should be a place of freedom of expression, academic freedom, and not an ideology imposed by the administration. Science should be about discovery, about finding solutions to diseases or technological inventions, and not about pushing a specific political agenda. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to emphasize real studies, real research, and not a political ideology.
Yes, well, the money we spend on research will go to
Hello,
research.
Everyone. I'm Natasha Fatha. Welcome inside the CBC Newsroom. And we've just been listening to Conservative Party Leader Pierre Poilievre answering questions from reporters at a campaign stop in Toronto. Also listening with CBC's Kate McKenna, joining us once again live from Ottawa. Kate, the standout points for you.
Well, I think the first question was quite interesting, and so was his response. I believe the question was something along the lines of, why haven't you reached out, or have you reached out to anyone in the American administration to sort of lobby against tariffs? Because we know that a number of lawmakers from different levels of government have been really pushing that diplomatic angle for months now, speaking to different people within the United States, lawmakers, trying to convince them that tariffs are a bad idea. And I believe this is the first time Pierre Poilievre has answered this so directly. He said that he believes in the idea of one prime minister, that he doesn't want to sort of muddy the waters by speaking quasi on behalf of Canada when the Liberal prime minister, who is a Liberal, is doing that right now. So that was an interesting response. It was actually very similar to what Mark Carney said during the transition from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney taking over as leader. He was also asked about one of the new ideas that he put forward today, the Keeping Canadians Working plan, which is an idea that he has. He says they did a similar thing during the recession of 2008, which is essentially offering loans to businesses that are directly affected by the trade dispute, where people might otherwise get laid off, and these directed loans would go to help keep people employed. And he was asked about specifics. He was asked, how much money would it be, over how many years, who would qualify, that sort of thing. And he said that it depends, unfortunately, because the smaller the tariffs, the smaller the fund, but the larger the tariffs, the bigger the fund. And then finally, he was asked by one of our colleagues about why it is, or how he feels about Mark Carney sort of parroting some of what Pierre Poilievre is also promising. Parroting might be a strong word, but the Liberals seem to be taking some of the Conservative ideas and announcing them as promises. One example would be faster permitting for energy projects. 2 days ago, for instance, they suggested looking at federal land for building. And Pierre Poilievre was asked what he thinks of that, and he said, well, these are the ideas I've had for a very long time. These are the ideas I've been proposing well before the Donald Trump tariff threats. And I'm the one who can credibly follow through on these plans, which would make Canada's economy stronger. So it was a considerable announcement that Pierre Poilievre made this morning, kind of outlining his plan for these tariff threats, and certainly an evolution of thought, even from February when he wasn't going into the specifics of this. So now we'll be interested to watch how his message resonates with Canadians.
Okay, CBC's Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome.
And there is deep uncertainty across the globe today, but there's also defiance. Canadians, along with anxious investors, manufacturers, and consumers in countries everywhere, are watching for a huge announcement from the White House Rose Garden this afternoon. At 4 p.m. Eastern, U.S. President Donald Trump will reveal the details of what he calls Liberation Day, a raft of what's been described as reciprocal tariffs on Canada and all countries that trade with the U.S. Let's dig deeper into this with our next guest. I'd like to invite to the show Ernie Tedeschi. He served as chief economist on the White House Council of Economic Advisors under U.S. President Joe Biden, and he's currently the director of economics at the Budget Lab at Yale University. Mr. Tedeschi, I know you've been waiting on the line patiently, sir. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can I begin with that issue of anxiety? Globally, everybody is on tenterhooks, just waiting to see what exactly the president is going to say today, what exactly we can anticipate in terms of these tariffs. What are you expecting to hear from President Trump?
You know, well, your guess is as good as mine at this point. You know, there have been reports that they're now considering a 20% broad tariff rather than a tit-for-tat reciprocal tariff. Further reports that they may refine that further to maybe a 15% tariff that you know may not apply to all countries. I think that the anxiety in the global business community is, number one, that there's still a lot of uncertainty about what tariff policy is in the United States. And two, that it's not going to end today, that, you know, even when, quote unquote, Liberation Day is done today, that's not going to be the end of it, and that there will be further announcements to come in the weeks and months ahead, and businesses don't know where it'll end.
So on that point, let's say we get a bit more certainty today by hopefully 5 p.m. Eastern. We know a little bit more than we do right now. We know that the president has said repeatedly that he's doing this to make the United States wealthy again. Like you said earlier, none of us are in the president's mind, but to the best of your knowledge, what is the rationale behind this? Will it make Americans more wealthy?
I think that they have two policy goals here. I think, number one, they want to increase domestic manufacturing in particular in the United States. And two, they want to raise revenue. Remember that this is happening in the context of a fiscal debate in the United States, where they're trying to extend tax cuts that were passed by then President Trump in his first term that are now expiring year, and they want to raise money to offset the cost of that. And they're looking to tariffs to offset some of that cost. The thing is that even under the broadest sort of policy that we've heard that might be announced today, say a 20% broad tariff, that would only offset about half the cost of permanently extending his tax cuts. And it would not, you know, bring manufacturing back to the United States on a net basis. It would actually make the United States economy smaller in the long run as a result. So for every factory that, you know, would be able to hire here in the United States, more factories would have to lay off jobs because their costs went up or because their foreign contracts were cut.
Another thing we've heard repeatedly from the U.S. president is that other countries, especially his friends, he says that American allies are ripping him off. He's made this point again and again when he's talking about Canada. Let me just ask you, as an American, are Canadians ripping you all off?
I mean, so first of all, the president himself signed the USMCA agreement under his term. It was one of his proudest achievements. The United States, you know, enjoys relatively low trade barriers with other countries, in particular with Canada. We would have, you know, we would have mostly balanced trade with Canada, if not for energy with Canada. We have a trade deficit with Canada when you include oil and natural gas. And we purchase oil and natural gas from Canada because we have high demand for energy. We're not getting ripped off. We're a rich country and we buy things that we want. There are absolutely narrow cases where I think that there are unfair trade practices, and where the United States should negotiate on a bilateral basis. That always happens, and tariffs have been used as a tool in the past for those disputes. That's not a new thing. But broad tariffs are not a negotiating tool meant to be used in that way. Broad tariffs are way too blunt an instrument for those, narrow sort of disputes that the United States may have. The United States. The United States enjoys a very good trade relationship with Canada, Mexico, the 18 other countries with which it has a free trade relationship. It doesn't need to impose tariffs on those countries.
Before I let you go, Mr. Tedeschi, let me ask you, what's your assessment of what's going to happen? As you said, today may not be the end. We're going to hear more and more and more announcements. But if we continue down this path with the American administration heading this way, becoming more isolated economically, wanting manufacturing, at least the hope of manufacturing staying in their country, and this much uncertainty on the global markets, what is that going to do to the American economy and to the global economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the global economy is definitely going to suffer as a result of this. And I have to say, in particular, the country other than the United States that is most exposed to our actions is Canada. In our modeling, we found that the economic hit to Canada was 3 times that of the United States. So Canadians will suffer the most, unfortunately, as a result of these American policies. I think that the biggest political question will be to see how American consumers react to the price increases that result from these tariffs. Remember, America, like many other countries in the world, has just come out of about 4 years of pandemic inflation. American consumers saw a big cost of living increase. They voted in President Trump in many ways because of that cost of living increase. I don't think that it'll be interesting to see how much they connect any price increases that result from this tariff with the current administration and whether there are political consequences for that.
Okay, we'll certainly be watching. Ernie Tedeschi, really great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. And before we head to break, a reminder that CBC News has special live coverage of Donald Trump's tariff announcement from the White House Rose Garden later on in the day. Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault will host the program alongside Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton and Power and Politics host David Cochran. Our coverage begins at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon on the West Coast, right here on CBC News Network, and we'll be back in just a moment. U.S. President Donald Trump will announce his sweeping tariff strategy today. Trump has hinted that every U.S. trading partner, including Canada, is going to take a hit with the levy. Trump will reveal all during a media conference from the White House Rose Garden at 4 p.m. Eastern, which we will bring you live right here on CBC News Network. And in the meantime, Prime Minister Mark Carney has joined other world leaders by promising to respond with retaliatory tariffs. Looking into all of this is CBC's senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong. So, Peter, big question election today. What impact are the tariffs going to have on consumers?
So it's important to remember what we're actually dealing with at 4 o'clock. This is the Americans announcing their tariffs on Canadian goods. Tariffs, just a fancy word for tax, paid by American importers and eventually passed on to American consumers. What that's going to do is drive down the demand for Canadian goods. And whether you're a mom and pop organization selling jewelry in the United States one piece at a time, or you export millions of cars a year, this is all going to have an impact here in Canada on demand. We've seen already that there's been a massive uptick in the amount of imports into the United States of people trying to get ahead of these tariffs. That's built up supply in the United States that they can now use to try to figure out what these next few months are going to be like. You can see how that's going to then turn into people trying to find other alternatives, trying to negotiate lower prices to offset the tariffs, and less demand in Canada. All of that demand means fewer hours worked, fewer shifts at the plant. All of those things, they're bad for growth, they're bad for the economy, they're bad for jobs. What it will mean for the Canadian consumer, though, is more to do with how Mark Carney responds, the government of Canada responds after all of this. And they say, here's what our retaliatory tariffs are. And they're trying to avoid the things that will hurt us the most and trying to hit the things that will hurt Americans the most. But it's a blunt tool. And it's a lousy way of doing business, right? They're going to drive up the costs of things that we want to buy, that we have been buying, and now that we're at this stage, we've already taken the easy stuff off the shelf. The American booze isn't for sale in a lot of provinces. Where are they going to target? What are they going to do? Those are the questions that are going to impact us as consumers. But the broad thing that's going to happen here is on both sides of the border, we're going to see less demand. We're going to see less growth. We're going to see a tougher time for consumers, for businesses, for everybody that's just trying to navigate their way through an already uncertain time.
So really clear that this is bad for consumers. What are you seeing in terms of the markets?
So the markets will be really interesting to watch, and if only because, the timing is not lost on us. They're making this announcement at 4 o'clock right after markets close, because the last thing they want is, the shot on the screen with the box in the corner that says the Dow Jones is down 300 points since this all started. Markets have been skeptical that any of this is going to happen. They have sold off considerably since like the middle of February, when they started to say, well, hold on a second, this president does sound like he's actually going to go through with this. Yeah. And then he imposed some tariffs that he didn't sort of give exemptions to, and the steel and aluminum tariffs, the Chinese tariffs. What this will do, if it goes, we're all guessing. We don't know what this is going to be. This was supposed to be retaliatory tariffs. It sounds like they didn't get their act together enough to figure out how that would actually work. So it's going to be some kind of tiered or blanket tariffs. And we don't know what level that's going to be at. We don't know whether they're going to be providing exemptions. There's so many questions. And markets have decidedly taken this kind of wait-and-see approach because they're so skeptical that he's going to go ahead with any of these. But I think if we see how this goes, if it goes in the direction we think it's going to, I think markets are going to sell off. But they're going to have to really wait until tomorrow morning. Right now, I'm just looking, all of the major markets, the TSX, the S&P 500, the Dow, they're all up, but they're up very slightly. Markets are very nervous. They're very concerned. And because, we've talked about this before, you and I, that if you're an importer of goods that are about to get tariffed, you can either eat that cost and not pass it on to consumers. Well, that's good for the consumer, it's good for inflation numbers, but it's bad for your margins, bad for earnings, which is bad for the stock market. Exactly. If you do pass that on to consumers, then it's bad for inflation, it's bad for growth. People are spending more money on the things they can't get away from, so they got less disposable income they can spend elsewhere. That's bad for economic growth. That too is bad for markets. So none of this is going to be good for stock markets writ large. It's certainly not going to be good for the economy writ large.
What more good news do you have for us?
I'm just bursting with good news today.
I love it. CBC Senior Business Correspondent Peter Armstrong. Thanks so much, Peter. All right, folks, let's keep the conversation going on the tariff front. We have now reached Martha Harrison for her take on all of this. She's an international trade lawyer and a partner at McCarthy Tétrault. Martha, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thanks very much for having me, Natasha.
Okay, I want to go back to the beginning of all of this. We're all sort of looking ahead to 4 p.m. Eastern and what the president is going to say. But let's go back, because the United States and Canada do have a standing trade agreement. And so for many, the question still remains, are these tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, any kind of tariffs that are new and being imposed by the president, justified legally in any way?
It's a great question. There's a lot of confusion around the application of the multilateral trade agreement, which is known in Canada as the CUSMA, which is the new NAFTA. Under the principles and the obligations of the new NAFTA, of the CUSMA, these tariffs would, by most accounts, be considered unlawful and contrary to the letter and to the spirit of the trade agreement. President Trump is currently using executive orders as a means to propose and administer these tariffs because he can do so under the guise of emergency. So he's relying on domestic US legislation, which allows him to enact certain types of executive orders if there is an emergency that needs to be addressed. I would say that that position is probably tenuous at best, and I would anticipate that as of maybe 5 o'clock this afternoon, there will be some legal action probably taking place in the US where there will be challenges to his authority to enact these tariffs under the executive order options.
You mentioned legal action that can be taken. So let's talk about the Canadian government, Canada as a whole. What legal options are available to us?
Well, under the CUSMA, there are dispute settlement procedures that are available to both Canada and to Mexico. The challenge is, notwithstanding the fact that it's likely that Canada would be successful under a challenge under the dispute resolution chapter of the CUSMA, that process itself is likely to take too long in order to have impact on the current scenario. And that's why we're really seeing Canada taking retaliatory measures in the form of surtaxes, retaliatory surtaxes. Those will have a quicker and deeper impact at the moment. The other method that Canada is using is non-tariff barriers to address the issue. Those are instances where, for example, we're not using tariffs as a pushback, but other measures likely mostly related to procurement. So, for example, a lot of provinces and some municipalities and the federal government have enacted measures that are not allowing U.S. bidders to bid on government contracts. Of course, we all know that another non-tariff barrier that is being used in Canada is in our alcohol distribution system, and that's where we have removed U.S. product from the shelves of, for example, the LCBO in Ontario.
You've mentioned a couple of times the parameters that are permitted within the CUSMA or the USMCA agreement. But let me ask you, does the agreement still stand considering the situation we find ourselves in?
It's actually very challenging to take account as to what the real practical status of this multilateral agreement is now. It is meant to be renegotiated in 2026. I think it's fair to say that we are seeing the live renegotiation of the CUSMA right now. And I think it's going to be very challenging for Canada and the US to have trust in the renegotiation process in the context where the trading partner between us is actually administering these tariffs, which many would suggest are unlawful. We will see how the renegotiations take place and whether there is sort of impact on the current administration of tariffs. There is going to have to be a give and take in those renegotiations. And of course, tariffs are going to be at the top of that list for discussion. But the trust that two of the three partners in that multilateral agreement have now in the benefit and in the use of that multilateral agreement is certainly called into question.
So then let me ask you, what kind of precedent does this send for future trade negotiations between any sets of partners? Because if you've got this agreement, the Americans, certainly US President Trump, could have waited to rework the agreement. They were set to do that next year anyway. He has chosen not to wait. He's chosen to take more direct action. We can certainly say that. So what is the meaning of a deal if the most powerful member of it just says at a moment, I'm not necessarily going to abide by it?
Well, it's interesting that you use the reference meaning of a deal when we're dealing with a president who is purporting to have the art of the deal. Trust is everything in diplomatic relations, and there is this concept of trust but verify. And so I think that that is likely the approach that all three parties are going to take, because as you've mentioned, Natasha, the whole point of these Trump tariffs are to address a number of issues that President Trump has articulated over the last several years and through his first presidency as well, have been irritants from a U.S. trade perspective on his line of reasoning. We are going to have to attempt this renegotiation obviously very carefully. And I think one of the key unknowns at the moment is who will be representing Canada at that negotiating table.
Okay, Martha Harrison, really good to have your insights today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Okay, let's go to Quebec, where Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet has just taken questions at a campaign stop. Let's listen in.
Ian Wood, CBC News for the TV pool. Mr. Carney says Bill 96 and supply management are off the table when it comes to negotiating with Donald Trump. Do you buy that?
No. I have had no reasons so far to believe his word. I'm glad he says that. But I'm looking for a way to make sure about that. We know that he is very hostile to Bill 96, which is very important for Quebecers. We know he wants to pay with Quebecers' money to challenge it up to the Supreme Court. It's not nothing. He knows that the President of the United States is also hostile to Bill 96. You know, it's not on the table until it is on the table. It's the same thing with supply management. We know clearly that there are voices in Western Canada that say, put that on the table. But he knows that many producers in Quebec particularly says don't do that. So he doesn't want to lose all those votes, so he pretends that he will do it. Maybe he would, maybe. Am I going to take his word? Not yet. There's one way to make it sure. If Quebecers decide, it's up to them. If Quebecers decide to give us enough seats, we will make sure. If we do, like we did in 2019 and 2021, take off the possibility for the Liberals to be in a majority government, then we can make sure that many specific interests for Quebec and sometimes other provinces will be respected and the right things will be implemented.
And you know, we don't know I mean, we have an idea of what Donald Trump's going to do later this afternoon, but what are you looking for in a response? You know, Mark Carney is still the Prime Minister who is going to be dealing with Donald Trump right now. What are you looking for in a response? Broad-based, dollar-for-dollar, surgical response? What are you looking for this afternoon?
I will resume some of the measures I propose here, but we will be back with it right after Mr. Trump says what he intends to do. But like I said, I don't know how to translate subvention salariale, but I'm glad you don't either.
Yeah, okay.
Feel better.
Yeah.
Salary subsidies.
Subsidies.
Okay, salary subsidies and
employees,
transitory cash for businesses and investment in innovation and opening new markets, more transformation of the territory, all kinds of Buy Canadian Act and in response to a Buy American Act, all measures that could help. We are, to be specific, in favor of an amount of counter tariffs which are at the same level as what Americans do. We strongly suggest to make deals with Mexico and some European states in order to have more people in those countries, more than 300 million people facing the United States with gross product which is higher than the gross product of the United States in order to make them bend the knee at the end of the day. And we propose that those counter tariffs should be surgically chosen with some exceptions because some parts of our economy are very fragile and those counter tariffs could be the end of them. So we have to be careful and strong at once.
Merci tout le monde. Ceci me fait
Bloc leader Yves-François Blanchet answering questions just a short while ago with reporters at a campaign event. So let's turn once again to CBC's Kate McKenna joining us live from Ottawa. Kate's watching everybody and everything. So what's the Bloc saying now?
Well, now we've heard from all three opposition leaders of the major parties. And he was asked specifically about whether or not Mark Carney would be true to his word and shield a couple of things that are very important to Quebec from any trade negotiations. So they talked about Bill 96, which is a revamped language law. A lot of Canadians might know it as Bill 101, but it has since been kind of rejigged and made stronger. And supply management, which of course very important to dairy farmers in Quebec. So Yves-François Blanchet says he's not taking Mark Carney at his word that he will shield those two things from any negotiations with the United States. Instead, he made his pitch to Quebecers saying, elect a number of Bloc Québécois MPs, maybe we'll hold the balance of power in the next parliament, and then we can force him not to trade away either of those issues, which of course are very important to Quebecers. But it speaks to sort of a Canadian issue going into this tariff threat because there are a number of regional priorities that whoever is elected to be the next Prime Minister will have to deal with. We've heard from Danielle Smith on oil and gas saying that can never be on the table. Of course, auto parts already targeted, but very important to Ontario. And then French language and supply management, two very important issues to Quebecers. So whoever is elected to be the next Prime Minister will have to take all of those regional considerations into consideration. But it is worth mentioning that all three of the people, Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, and Jagmeet Singh, have all said that language is off the table as something that could be part of negotiations. The United States put out a list of trade irritants and included Bill 96 on that. But Yves-François Blanchet also took the opportunity to note that Mark Carney said he would seek intervener status if Bill 96 goes to the Supreme Court. And the reason why he said that he would do that is because in the drafting of the bill, it preemptively used the notwithstanding clause, and so the federal government has to stand up for the charter. But we're not at that point yet, but it did provide a little bit of fodder for the Bloc Québécois in this election.
Okay, CBC's Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Thanks again, Kate.
You're welcome.
Also in Quebec, there's a lot of talk about tariff. There's a lot of concern, specifically in the province's food products industry. It's among the top 10 Quebec exports to the United States. CBC Sarah Levitt is on that part of the story for us and joins us now live. So Sarah, talk to us about where you are right now and what are the types of concerns that you're hearing?
Natasha, we're at a place in Laval called Basse Nuts, and it makes, trail mixes, nuts, as well as dried fruit. And you said it, the food industry in Canada is huge. In Quebec, it amounts to about $3.5 billion in exports. Here in particular at this company, their sales to the U.S. is about 5%, so not so much of their company, but they do rely on a lot of sourcing from the United States. It's about 15 to 20%, so that's where they might get peanuts, for example, cashews, almonds, and some chocolate. And they've been saying that this back and forth with the tariffs has already had an effect. One of the major things untariff related, of course, is the feeble Canadian dollar. And so when they're dealing with that, that doesn't help things, and then add the tariffs. And so they're trying to strategize. How do we deal with this given what we expect to come this afternoon from Donald Trump? And so they said, maybe we'll look to other markets, Asia, Africa. And what they're telling me, too, is that the added additional transport costs would actually be less than the tariffs. So a little bit of strategizing in all this uncertainty.
Wow, that's really interesting that sending the stuff overseas would be cheaper than tariffs, something to certainly watch. How are the people that you've been speaking to today, Sarah, responding to how the Canadian government has been retaliating or reacting to the tariffs?
Yeah, so I was talking a bit about the percentages there, and because 20% of their products comes from the United States, they're hit with the retaliatory tariffs instead. And that makes it not easy for them. The understanding, at least from one of the VPs of this company that I was speaking to, was, we do need to stand up, obviously, but it does hurt. And perhaps it would be better for the Canadian government to incentivize business and manufacturing here with grants and the like, rather than imposing stiff tariffs. Let's hear from him.
If it becomes a permanent, I think it's a greater issue, not just for businesses, but also for all the citizens, right? Because ultimately, all the costs that we need to bear due to imposition of new tariffs, we're going to have to roll it onto the end consumer. So I think personally, that's going to be has the inflationary ability to increase the cost for all consumers here in Canada. And I think it's going to be, giving the weak economy that we currently have, I think it's going to create a much longer issue.
So as we hear more and more about the tariffs, and we just try to get an understanding, or businesses do, it's great that we're able to speak to them individually. Yesterday I was at an aerospace company, and so you understand at a granular level just how these tariffs are going to affect them, and that speaks to the wider impact that these tariffs will have. And I know, at least here, they're waiting with bated breath to see what Donald Trump says this afternoon and if there's going to be any indication about how long these tariffs will be in place.
Okay, CBC Sarah Levitt in Laval. Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, so we've been talking all day about all that fear over how the markets may respond to Donald Trump's tariff announcement. Just like Peter Armstrong was telling us earlier, so far, things are mostly calm. In Toronto, the TSX is up a touch, almost 50 points. At the Dow in New York, that has turned green as well. It started down, but it's now ahead more than 170 points. It's the same story for the NASDAQ, now up nearly 90 points. The Canadian dollar is falling on the day and trading at just a little under 70 cents US. West Texas crude has been holding steady all week at above $71 a barrel, while gold is up again today, ahead nearly $12 and worth well over $3,100 an ounce. You are watching CBC News Network.
This market update is brought to you by Emirates. Fly Emirates. Fly better.
U.S. and Canadian mayors from the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River region are meeting today. Guess what's on their mind? You know what it is. It's the tariffs. Specifically, all the ways these new levies are going to hurt their citizens and the economies on both sides of the border. Mark Carney is joining me now in studio. You've been listening into that meeting. So what are we hearing from the Canadian mayors about what we're going to find out from the president later on in the day?
Now, Natasha, it was a digital meeting. They all tuning in from their homes, I guess. Now, the U.S. and Canadian mayors of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, it's different from the Border Cities Mayors Alliance that we profiled last week. This is often larger or medium-sized cities that do some big business across the border with each other. So he spoke about the Canadian mayors. Canada was represented by Matt Cisco, the mayor of St. Catharines, Ontario, Olivia Chow, the mayor of Toronto, and Rob Burton, the mayor of Oakville, Ontario. Rob Burton spoke a little bit about the impact impact on auto tariffs, especially because the city of Oakville has a Ford plant in it. Olivia Chow talked about how a lot of big city mayors here in Canada are really seeing the impact of this tariff threat already. She says they need to speak on one voice. They need to tell U.S. President Donald Trump to cut it out. And she told us about a manufacturer that she spoke to yesterday who says they're already feeling the chill.
He employed 800 people, and he's down now at 300 people. Why? Because he is compressing the shifts, and they are working 2 or 3 days instead of 5 days. And it's because the order is stopped. It's not coming in anymore because of the uncertainty. And he knows that it's going to be a problem. So it's already starting to be felt.
The uncertainty she's speaking of, obviously, tariffs on Canadian goods mean prices go up for Americans, mean fewer orders come in, means there are fewer exports for Canadian manufacturers into the U.S.
Okay, so let's talk about the American mayors who also took part in this. For many of them, Canada is their biggest export market. So
Yes.
what are you hearing from their end?
Pretty much all of them in this case. So we heard from Chevy Johnson, he's the mayor of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, Malik Evans of Rochester, New York, and Austin Bonta of Portage, Indiana. They all kind of said the same thing, just with different numbers. Canada is the top destination of their exports. In Wisconsin's case, for example, $8 billion last year. Thousands or tens of thousands of jobs at stake in each of these states. They spoke about how intertwined the economies are. Even Illinois talking about how trade disruptions could lead to spikes at grocery stores. And on that point, Malik Evans, the mayor of Rochester, New York, mentioned that he worries about some of his most at-risk residents, particularly those who are at or below the poverty line.
These folks already are making impossible decisions with their incomes and expenses: rent or medicine, rent or healthy foods, rent or school clothes for their children. And you can just imagine how much, how a $1,300 a month cost of living increase that these tariffs are expected to generate will impact these already heartbreaking calculations.
Mayor Evans says specifically in his state, New York State, 55,000 jobs at risk and $17.4 billion in revenue.
Gosh, just bad news all around anyway. We'll see what happens come 4 p.m. CBC's Mark Carney, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And speaking of which, here's a live look at Washington. Now, we are waiting for that huge announcement to come from the White House Rose Garden this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern. U.S. President Donald Trump is going to announce some of the details of what he calls Liberation Day. We are anticipating reciprocal tariffs on Canada, but all countries that the U.S. currently trades with. Now, we're going to bring you live coverage of that and preemptive coverage as well, setting up what we're going to hear from the president. That's going to be hosted by our chief correspondent, Adrienne Arsenault. We also have, joining her, chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, along with the host of Power and Politics, David Cochran. They're all going to set up what we can anticipate financially, politically, and emotionally, really, when this announcement comes through today, because so many people across the country on both sides of the border really are going to be watching to see what the president has to say. And remember, as we heard from Ernie Tedeschi earlier in the show, this is not the end of the story. There will be continued announcements on the tariff front coming in. So we'll continue to watch all of that for you, separate fact from fiction, bring you the reality of the situation, and bring you the best analysis we can. You are watching CBC News Network. Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Fatah. Welcome inside the CBC Newsroom. There is deep uncertainty right across the world today, but also there is a sense of defiance. You're looking live at Washington and Ottawa this hour. Canadians, along with investors, manufacturers, and consumers in countries all across the globe, are anxiously awaiting a huge announcement from the White House Rose Garden this afternoon, one that could upend the global economy as we know it. At 4 p.m. Eastern, U.S. President Donald Trump is going to reveal the details of what he describes as Liberation Day, basically a raft of what has been described as reciprocal tariffs on Canada and all countries that trade with the United States. In anticipation of what's to come, Liberal Leader Mark Carney is off the campaign trail and back in Ottawa. He's acting in his role as Prime Minister and holding meetings about Canada's response to Donald Trump's announcement. Meanwhile, the other party leaders are putting forward responses of their own. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre delivered a keynote address in Toronto outlining how his government would handle the situation. And that is where we begin this hour with CBC's Kate McKenna, who is in our Parliamentary Bureau in Ottawa. Kate, let's begin with Pierre Poilievre. He gave us the most fulsome speech yet on what he would do if he were the Prime Minister in the face of Donald Trump's tariff threats. What did he have to say?
Yeah, he outlined his entire plan, and it was certainly the clearest he's ever been on this subject. He said that if Trump goes ahead, we need an immediate response. After that, we need to tackle the dispute after the election, hopefully bringing it to an end. And then we also need a long-term plan to build an economic fortress so we're never vulnerable to these economic threats again. So he suggested targeted reciprocal tariffs intended to do maximum pain to Americans while impacting Canadians the least amount possible. He also suggested an immediate renegotiation of the NAFTA, the CUSMA, the free trade deal between Canada and the United States and Mexico, and also calling for a pause on tariffs while the details of that renegotiation are hammered out. So that would be a pause on American tariffs while also pausing Canada's reciprocal tariffs. Of course, Donald Trump would have to agree to that, but at this point, we're talking fully hypothetical. He also suggested creating a fund to give temporary loans to companies affected in order to keep people working, people who work for trade-exposed companies who might be in the position of losing their job because of these tariffs. And he also suggested committing any revenue from increased trade between the United States and Canada to defense spending. We know that Canada not hitting its target of 2% of GDP on defense spending is an irritant in the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. He also said he would agree to secure our border, more so than it already is, while also working with Americans to prevent illegal guns from entering Canada. He also talked about what he called red lines and what cannot be negotiated when CUSMA is renegotiated by the two countries. He said that Canadians, that you don't put all the cards on the table when you're in negotiation, but Canadians have the right to know what the red lines are. Here's what he said.
First, I will protect our control over our border, our security, our resources, our farmers, including our supply-managed farmers, our fresh water, our automotive workers. Also, we will protect our sovereignty, our laws, our currency, our dollar, our land, our waters, our sky, our culture, our official languages, and our resources and Indigenous rights will not be under the control of any other country. This is non-negotiable. We will protect Canada's sovereignty in any negotiations.
So this was an event that was described as a keynote address. However, it was conservatives who were in the room. It was party faithful or supporters who were invited to that event. And it does show an evolution in his thinking. I mean, we can think back to when Donald Trump first made the tariff threats, where Pierre Poilievre was also critical of the government for its treatment of the border, saying that we needed to secure our borders. Now he has a fulsome plan that he's presented on this day that a lot of Canadians are watching to see what Donald Trump does. And he was also asked about why he hasn't reached out to any American lawmakers as part of a kind of cross-party effort to convince Americans that these tariffs will hurt both Canadians and Americans. And he said, well, at this point, I'm not the Prime Minister, and I believe that that's a job for the Prime Minister. I believe in one Prime Minister at a time. And right now, that is Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney.
What have we heard from the other opposition leaders?
Well, we heard from both NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh and Bloc Québécois Leader Yves-François Blanchet. And Jagmeet Singh had a real pro-worker message. He appeared with workers in Manitoba. Today, he reiterated some of the things he's already said, which is that he believes in reciprocating. He also believes in a Buy Canada approach when it comes to future infrastructure projects, not only using Canadian materials, but also using Canadian workers. And he says electing an NDP member of parliament means that you would have someone in Ottawa who would fight for you. Here's more of what he said.
Donald Trump is attacking not just our country, attacking our workers and our very way of life. He wants us to compromise our values. He wants to compromise in who we are. We will not compromise. We will not back down. We will not give up, and we will win this fight.
Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet was at a lumber mill in eastern Quebec, and he was asked if he believed Mark Carney when the Liberal leader said that he would shield supply management and Quebec's language law, Bill 96, from any negotiations. He said no, he doesn't believe them. He's happy that Mark Carney said that in the first place, but the only way to be sure that Canadians, or that Quebecers in his case, will not have those things that are very important to them in trade negotiations is to elect Bloc Québécois members and therefore potentially have the balance of power and force a minority government to act on that. He was also asked about what he would like to see the Canadian government do when these trade announcements or when these tariff announcements come out. Here's what he had to say.
We are, to be specific, in favor of an amount of counter tariffs which are at the same level as what Americans do. We strongly suggest to make deals with Mexico and some European states in order to have more people in those countries, more than 300 million people facing the United States.
We haven't yet heard today from Liberal Leader Mark Carney. We know he returned to Ottawa and is planning on having meetings today. First, before Donald Trump's announcement with his Council on U.S.-Canada Relations. And this is a group of labor leaders, of industry leaders who have provided advice to both Mark Carney and his predecessor, Justin Trudeau. Then the announcement's going to happen at 4 o'clock. And after that, he's meeting with his cabinet committee. So we're waiting to see if he has any sort of public remarks to be held after that. At this point, we don't know yet.
CBC's Kate McKenna in Ottawa. Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome.
And as Kate was referencing that major tariff announcement coming from the U.S. president from the White House Rose Garden at 4 p.m., that's being described as Liberation Day by the U.S. president. There's a lot of concern also about another round of tariffs about to hit Canada, 25% across the board that was previously put on hold. Now, that pause expires today unless it's renewed. Lots to keep track of. Let's turn to CBC's Katie Nicholson, who's joining us now from Washington. What are you hearing, Katie?
Well, that is that 25% that you'll remember the U.S. agreed to suspend it was basically on CUSMA-compliant businesses until April 2nd. Well, guess what? April 2nd today. So the question is what happens? Ottawa-based international trade lawyer William Pellerin said that that exemption, which really had been giving Canadian businesses a bit of a lifeline in the midst of all of this chaos, unless it is renewed today, this afternoon, those tariffs are likely going to come into effect. Here is William Pellerin.
Proving that CUSMA origination was a very, very big deal and allowed companies over the last few weeks to save vast amounts of tariffs and continue to ship to the United States duty-free. It is that exemption that is now lifted that is going to cause a lot of harm in the coming days unless it's renewed, and we'll learn more about that from the Rose Garden this afternoon.
Okay, so supposing those tariffs come into full effect, then you've got the auto tariffs, you've got steel and aluminum tariffs, energy tariffs, and whatever is announced today in the Rose Garden at 4 o'clock. So Canada has to figure out how will all of that accumulate? Do they stack on top of each other? And how does that hit the Canadian economy? There's very big questions today from Mark Carney in his role as Prime Minister as he and the team adjust their response. Now, Ontario Premier Doug Ford out today appealing again on American networks and cautioning about how this is going to damage both countries. Here's a little bit of Ford on CNN.
These tariffs is nothing but a tax on Americans, and President Trump calls it Liberation Day. I call it termination day because a lot of people are going to be terminated from their jobs. We're the #1 customer. We buy more goods off the U.S. than any country in the world, more than Japan, the UK, and France combined. And if you go after Canada, we have no choice but retaliate. And I apologize to the American people. We shouldn't be doing this.
Now, yesterday, the White House confirmed whatever it is that's announced today at 4 p.m., those tariffs are supposed to be effective immediately. And that is a tall order because we don't know how these tariffs are going to be structured. Are they going to be tiered, tailored to specific countries, or might we see some sort of flat rate? So just consider this for a second, okay? So the U.S. imports about $3.2 trillion of goods every year. $3.2 trillion. So just think about the logistics of trying to implement something like that so quickly on so many products. Business leaders are complaining about a lack of clarity. They're going to lawmakers asking how they can get a carve out. And just expect that the market today is going to react very swiftly. And then you're going to hear from the heads of other nations. What are the retaliatory plans that are going to roll out from Canada, from Mexico, China? The European Commission also talking tough. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer resolved to take whatever action he says is needed today in the House to protect the national interests of the UK. So there are also fears as well that these tariffs are really going to further weaken the U.S.'s alliances with other countries. And then, of course, there are the effects at home. So Ernie Tedeschi is the director of the economics at the Budget Lab at Yale. And he really sees that American consumers are going to be hit hard by all of this. Here's a little bit of Ernie Tedeschi.
America, like many other countries in the world, has just come out of about 4 years of pandemic inflation. American consumers saw a big cost of living increase. They voted in President Trump in many ways because of that cost of living increase. I don't think that it'll be interesting to see how much they connect any price increases that result from this tariff with the current administration and whether there are political consequences for that.
Now, Tedeschi's Yale Budget Lab actually did an estimate on what this could cost the average American consumer. It's saying about $2,700 to $3,400 per year. And that's coming as consumer confidence is plummeting. People are spending less. And, there seems to be a general amount of unease here just among people. But at the same time, the White House really trying to push the message that tariffs are good today, sent out a press release ahead of this Rose Garden announcement with a number of links to studies. It says prove that the Trump administration is on the right track and that tariffs are good for the economy. And of course, President Donald Trump taking to Truth Social, talking about what an exciting day this is, Liberation Day, as he's called it.
There was meant to be some pushback on the president's announcement that was meant to happen in the Senate yesterday, mostly led by Democrats, but there was a handful of Republicans that were supporting this challenge. Now, we heard from Tim Kaine yesterday, both speaking out just outside the Capitol, but also on CBC News Network. So I want to play a bit of that conversation for you.
These tariffs against Canada, our #1 trade partner, an ally and friend, make absolutely no sense. The stated reason for the emergency that there's a fentanyl crisis of fentanyl coming into the United States from Canada is invented and specious.
So, Katie, just bring us up to speed. Where is that challenge at this point? What is going on?
Okay, so this was that sort of resolution that was supposed to be voted on yesterday. Cory Booker took to the floor for a record-breaking speech in the Senate yesterday, so it got pushed to this afternoon. There is expected to be debate around this. This is Tim Kaine's resolution, of course, that is challenging the notion of using emergency powers, citing the fentanyl crisis of vast amounts of fentanyl supposedly coming across the Canadian border, which, of course, statistics do not back up. And so he's pushing back on that to try to eliminate those initial round of tariffs and to try to strike down the president's order or ability to use that order in this instance. The thing is, basically, all of the Democrats have to vote in favor of this afternoon, as well as at least 4 Republicans. Now, there is a Republican co-sponsor, Rand Paul, and there has been some vocal support or musings of support, or I would say musings of interest, perhaps, from some Republican senators who have close geographic and economic ties to Canada. And that has actually prompted Donald Trump to post some messages on Truth Social overnight, actually name-checking some Republican senators he's hoping to keep in line. Individuals he's clearly worried about: Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, really trying to get them back on the Republican bandwagon. Here's a little bit of that message that he put up on Truth Social overnight. He's urging them to fight the Democrats' wild and flagrant push to not penalize Canada for the sale into our country of large amounts of fentanyl by tariffing the value of this horrible and deadly drug in order to make it more costly to distribute and buy. And he goes on to say that that bill is not going to go anywhere because the House will never approve it. That's actually probably right, because it is a Republican-led House. And as your president, I will never sign it. Why are they allowing fentanyl to pour into our country unchecked and without penalty? So it is worth noting last week that a U.S. intelligence report did not mention fentanyl from Canada as any kind of a serious foreign threat to the United States. Anyway, it is just going to be an interesting vote to watch, because will these named senators cave to pressure and fall in line, or are they going to make a statement in opposition of these tariffs on what is a very big and important day, clearly, for President Trump?
CBC's Katie Nicholson in Washington. Thank you, Katie. And as we continue to wait for more information on these tariffs, Canadians are on the edge about the impact this will have on our economy. So for more on that, let's turn to Kevin Page. He's a former parliamentary budget officer and president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Kevin Page, thank you very much for making time for us.
Good to be with you, Natasha.
I wonder if we could please begin, sir, by just a very broad question, which is, what is the state of our economy right now, and how vulnerable are we to these tariffs that are likely going to come through today?
Yeah, so the state of the economy is good, I think, overall in terms of growth. You know, we're growing at a modest rate, but a healthy rate in the kind of the 1.5% range on a year-over-year basis. Our unemployment rate is sitting at about 6.5%. Inflation, the latest numbers, it spiked a little bit, about 2.5%. But I think on balance, the state of the economy is fine. I think we're very vulnerable, however, to this shock, as is the United States, as the rest of the world economy. We've had shocks recently, the financial crisis in 2008, the pandemic in 2020. I think it's hurt the government pocketbooks. It's hurt household pocketbooks. So I think the whole world, we really don't need a trade war right now.
And remind us also, please, how intertwined our two economies between the United States and Canada are, particularly from our end, how dependent we are on the United States.
Yeah, we're very intertwined. I think, you often hear numbers when you listen to CBC, the billions of dollars that flow literally on a daily basis. Roughly, 3/4 of our trade, we're a big trading country, but 1/3 of our GDP is export related. 75% of that actually goes to the United States. But I think just in terms of the flows of goods and services and people, we're highly integrated and have been for a long time.
You mentioned earlier that our economy is stable, it's doing okay. It doesn't feel that way for many Canadians that we've been speaking to. There does seem to be this sense of things are on the verge of imploding, and particularly with the reality of these tariffs coming into effect. What's going on there? Why is there this sense of lack of confidence in our economy?
Yeah, so I think consumer confidence is really important. And we've seen it is literally falling at a fast rate in the United States right now. It's really quite shocking, their consumer confidence. So I think, Americans are realizing that this trade war is going to impact them in a hard way. I think it's having a similar impact on us. I think Canadians, Americans, Europeans, we're all still feeling the effect of high price levels that have stemmed from that post-COVID inflation. So all our and we're a high we have a lot of debt at the household level. So our budgets are stretched right now. If it wasn't for this trade war, we'd still have work to do. But this trade war again is just a dark cloud that we don't need.
So we don't need it, but we have to deal with it. And so now we are here with a set of tariffs that have already come into effect, reciprocal tariffs likely to come. What is the Canadian economy's capacity to sustain these hits and just keep the economy afloat?
Yeah, so I think we've seen numbers come out from the Bank of Canada, from the Parliamentary Budget Office. from various forecasters, chartered banks like the Royal Bank of Canada. We've seen numbers from the Conference Board. We're headed for a modest recession right now if we get the numbers a lot of people expect in terms of the pronouncements we've seen from the United States with respect to these tariffs and reciprocal tariffs announcements we'll get today. It's a modest recession. We have fiscally, Canada's in a relatively good position. Our deficit is much lower than the United States, about a third of what it is relative to the size of the economy. It's lower than most OECD economies. We have the fiscal room to maneuver to provide supports for all these sectors that are going to be hit hard, that are being hit hard now, and that potentially will be hit. We'll get news later today, might be again hit over the next number of weeks, months.
And how is the Bank of Canada watching all of this unfold?
Yeah, so the Bank of Canada made, I think, a strategic move with this latest release. It actually reduced interest rates. So we've had more than 2 percentage points reduction in the policy interest rate. They're aware of this. The monetary policy report that came out by the Bank of Canada in January provided analysis on the tariff impact that said that we could lose as much as 2.5 percentage points of GDP, which would be could be upwards of $70 billion in our $3.1 trillion economy. So they're definitely monitoring all this. They're studying this. The next policy rate announcement we get from the Bank of Canada will be in a couple of weeks on April 16th. My guess is that we can get another interest rate adjustment, a downward adjustment, provide a little bit of more relief for those people, those affordability concerns that you highlighted, Natasha.
Kevin, I wonder if I could ask you, because many have argued that the reason we find ourselves currently in the midst of a federal election is because of what's happening in the United States, this trade war that we're now in the middle of, that we didn't ask for and no one necessarily wants except for the president. What does the next prime minister need to do? What do you need in terms of a game plan to manage this? Because if we're going to continuously be hit with these chaotic announcements that may or may not happen based on arguments that may not be based on reality, like the fentanyl crisis, what does Canada need to do? What's the appropriate policy that needs to be in place?
Yeah, so I think so much has happened. Even though we are an election campaign, we've seen, just listening to your CBC, just in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister is back in Ottawa. He will meet with, with his Team Canada group. These are, advisors from the business community. He will meet, he'll have meetings with his cabinet. He's been, several meetings with the premiers. So we put this consultative infrastructure in place, which is really valuable. I think all political leaders in this country are talking about this big issue. So there's just enormous focus. I think they're gaming out different scenarios in the background in terms of how to deal with this angst and these unexpected, unanticipated events that may happen in the days ahead. I think after the election, we're probably going to need to see some version of a budget that's going to have to provide support packages for all the sectors and individuals that are being hurt, including steel, including automotive, including agriculture and other sectors. We're going to need supports, not unlike that we saw supports in the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 global pandemic. But we have the fiscal room to provide those supports, which is very strategic on our part.
Kevin Page, thank you so much for your time.
Good to be with you, Natasha.
It's our pleasure. All right, friends, now let's take you to Windsor, Ontario. It's often called Canada's auto capital. The Stellantis assembly plant is located there, as well as 2 Ford engine plants and many auto-related manufacturers. And that's where we also find CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick. She's joining us from inside Windsor City Hall. Megan, describe the mood there.
Well, it is a gloomy day here, Natasha. It's been raining all day, thunder, lightning. That's partly why we're inside City Hall right now. And that kind of matches the mood of some people here in this city. There's kind of a sense of heaviness hanging over people, these tariffs looming over them, and the uncertainty as to how these tariffs will end up impacting Windsor. And the city is bracing for a big impact, and that is because of how vital the auto industry is to this city. It has a long history with it, and thousands of jobs depend on it. So we've been talking to people about how they've been feeling in anticipation of today, where people will finally learn Donald Trump's tariff plan. Here's what one resident of Windsor told me just a little while ago.
Windsor's where auto started in Canada, and there's a lot of influence here with the auto industry. tariffs are going to hurt everybody. They're going to hurt both sides of the border. Yeah, it's just Trump trying to pay for his rich buddies to have extra income, and it doesn't make any sense.
And Natasha, other people that live here have been talking to us kind of about the tension that they feel at the border, essentially, with the Americans just on the other side in Detroit. And a lot of people in Windsor frequently cross back and forth across the border. And some of them aren't doing that as much as they used to, and telling me that it just feels different. So the mood here is different. There's also a lot of stressing and anxiety, partly being felt by Windsor's mayor. We did speak to him earlier this morning here at City Hall, and he said it's been a frustrating time because of the uncertainty and not knowing exactly what Donald Trump is going to do with all of these tariffs. Here's a little bit of our conversation with the mayor. Oh, sorry. Not throwing to that clip. I was using a clip of him earlier, but he was saying to us that while Donald Trump calls today Liberation Day, he views it as liberation from that uncertainty. And he just wants to know what the plan is so that the city can move forward. But he is hopeful. He's saying that Donald Trump doesn't follow through on the threat. But if he does, they are bracing for job losses in this city.
Okay. You've been speaking to workers in Windsor. What are they telling you?
They have been telling me about the fear and anxiety that they've been feeling. Yesterday, I met with Chad Lawton, who is a representative for Unifor, the local union here, and he's worked at one of the Ford plants for more than 30 years. And he says there's a lot of fear that people will lose their jobs. Older workers are worried about their retirement. Younger workers are worried about their future and whether they will have one in the auto industry or not. So definitely a sense of stress, but he also says a sense of resolve is being felt and determination. These workers are preparing to fight to keep their jobs on the Canadian side of the border. Here's more of what he told me.
The reality is, if push comes to shove and we have to fight for it, we will. And I think that there's a growing sentiment as this becomes real for many people that were hoping that it was going to go away on its own or we would talk our way through it, that these are Canadian jobs and we'll do what we have to do to protect them.
And he was talking about the supply chain and how a lot of companies that supply the parts to Ford to make the engines, that those are smaller companies and they may not be able to shoulder the burden of these tariffs and the costs. And if they can't keep operating and supplying the parts to Ford, then that's when the Ford plant might get hit with job losses if they can't make the engines and don't have the work to do. So he was saying that he thinks those might be the first dominoes to fall, he said. As for the workforce, he said what he's hearing from the company, he said Ford has been making commitments to the workforce, but he said those sentiments are a little bit hollow right now. And he said he acknowledged it's a difficult time for the companies to plan, not knowing exactly what's going on. As for the workforce, yesterday we did talk to a couple of workers at the Stellantis plant here in Windsor. Here's some of what they're feeling.
It's scary, that's for sure. I mean, the thing is, with Trump over there, he's changing his mind every 2 seconds. So it's like, you know, one day you think you're working for the next like 3 months, and then the next day it's like, oh, we might be getting laid off like next week. So
we're confused. We don't know what's going to happen, but I mean, we're sticking together. We're going to get through together like we did with COVID and everything else that hit this place. We've survived, and I think we'll survive this too.
Until something actually happens, there's no sense in worrying about it. So that's all I have to say, really.
And they were also telling us there are a lot of rumors going around at the plant in terms of possible layoffs, maybe even as early as next week. But again, those are just rumors. They have not been told anything by the company. So at this point, again, Natasha, it's just a lot of uncertainty for these workers. And Chad Lawton from the union saying they will be watching Donald Trump's news conference later today very closely, very carefully, and also watching for Canada's response to Trump.
CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Windsor, Ontario. Thank you, Megan. And a reminder that CBC News has special live coverage of Donald Trump's tariff announcement that's going to be hosted by CBC's chief correspondent, Adrian Arsenault, alongside with chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, and the host of Power and Politics, David Cochrane. Our coverage begins at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon on the West Coast, right here on CBC News Network. U.S. President Donald Trump will announce his sweeping tariff strategy today. Trump has hinted that every U.S. trading partner, including Canada, is going to be hit with the levy. Trump will reveal all during a media conference from the White House at the Rose Garden this afternoon. In the meantime, Mark Carney has left the campaign trail today for meetings with his cabinet and public sector advisors on Canada-U.S. relations. So for more on this, we have Stephanie Chouinard. She's an associate professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada. Stephanie, thanks so much for making time for us today.
It's my pleasure.
Never a dull news day, but I got to tell you, this is a big one. So let's talk about Trump's tariffs. They're dominating the campaign trail. They've arguably been the reason we're in a federal election right now. What do you think needs to be the messaging from Canadian political leaders?
That they're going to stand up for Canadians, and that there's a certain number of red lines that they're not going to be willing to cross in future negotiations with the United States. And we've seen lots of pressures obviously coming from the auto sector, which needs a certain amount of reassurance. Obviously, they're one of the biggest hit sectors, among with mining and oil, in terms of what tariffs would mean for the Canadian GDP. But we're also seeing a lot of pressure coming from the government of Quebec, especially since yesterday, as we saw that the famous or infamous Bill 96 is explicitly stated as one of the irritants for the purpose of trade between Canada and the U.S. So in Quebec, that's been drawing a lot of attention since yesterday. What are the leaders promising to do or not to do with respect to cultural protections?
Well, then let's talk about Bill 96. As you've described it, it's a red line that the leaders need to say we're not going to cross it. This is, for folks at home, this is Quebec's language bill. Essentially, that French and English need to be side by side on, in this instance, products that are going back and forth between Canada and the United States, and products that are sold in Canada. As you said, President Trump has said this is a barrier to trade, that it's an issue for them and they would like to see the French removed. Is this, in fact, another attempt to undermine Canadian identity and our sense of sovereignty? Because this is one of the big things that makes us distinct.
Yeah, of all the things that the present administration has been raising in terms of irritants with respect to Canada-U.S. trade, this one is actually not a new one. And a lot of people have been very keen to state since yesterday that this was something that was already raised by the Biden administration, that they were worried about the impact that that Bill 96 would have on trade, particularly, obviously, in Quebec. But it's also important to note that Canada is not the only trade partner that the U.S. has that has language laws with respect to the types of languages that are being used on commercial goods that are being sold. The EU has very strict language laws. If anyone has purchased, a package of European cookies or even cosmetics, you'll see that there's about 8 or 9 different languages that need to be on there. So the main issue is that obviously the Canadian market is a lot smaller, and some of the goods that would be traded with the European Union are not the same as the ones that are being traded with Canada. So the irritant is higher because the cost-benefit analysis for American companies is very different than when you're looking at the European market.
You referenced at the beginning of our conversation a list of things that the leaders need to do. Of our major political leaders who are running in this federal election, is someone getting it right? Is someone being exceptionally effective on this file, to your mind?
So we've heard Pierre Poilievre try to pivot towards talking about trade, and he was trying to be a little bit more forceful about this in Toronto this morning. But there's a bit of a credibility gap between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre on this specific file. Pollster after pollster has been demonstrating that when Canadians are asked who they would trust more to deal with Donald Trump, Mark Carney comes out on top, often in the double digits by comparison to Mr. Poilievre. So there's a lot of work that's needing to be done by the Conservative to catch up on this front. And as we've seen, in the last few days, there's a little bit of infighting under the big blue tent as to what the strategy should be, whether they should be talking about the other bread and butter issues that they've planned their campaign around, such as obviously housing, the cost of living, crime, the carbon tax. Obviously that's gone now, but that pivot is starting to happen. It's going to be interesting to see how Pierre Poilievre reacts to what's coming at us at 4 p.m. this afternoon. But so far, the Liberals, if only by virtue of who Mark Carney is and the credibility that he brings to this file, has been coming on top in Canadian minds so far.
Well, you might have already answered it, but then let me ask you, who needs to do better in terms of convincing Canadians that they will stand up to Donald Trump?
It seems like on that front, the gap is playing in Mark Carney's favor. So Mr. Poilievre needs to work a little bit harder on this one. It's a question of the message that's being conveyed, but a lot of folks have also been talking about the tone that the Conservatives have used. The fact that, the use of the three-word slogans that sort of recall a Trump kind of style of rhetoric, the fact that we're seeing Danielle Smith sort of throwing oil on the fire of the relationship between Conservatives in Canada and Republicans in the U.S., who are now not necessarily being seen as allies. So there's a lot of things that have not been going Mr. Poilievre's way in order for that idea in Canadians' minds to change so far. But there's still quite a long time in the campaign for him to do that pivot.
Right, and anything could happen between now and Election Day. Stephanie Chouinard, thank you so much for your time today.
It's my pleasure.
An Ottawa man has been found guilty on all charges related to his activities with a neo-Nazi group. 27-year-old Patrick McDonald was convicted on all three charges that he faced. That includes participating in terrorist activity, facilitating terrorist activity, and committing an offense for a terrorist group. No sentencing date has been set. In the United States, an electoral blow for the Trump administration in the battleground state of Wisconsin. That state has elected a democratically aligned judge to its Supreme Court. Susan Crawford will now join the state court, which will retain its 4-3 Liberal majority, with voters going against the candidate endorsed by the president and financially supported by Elon Musk. Musk's investment in the campaign made it the most expensive state judicial race of all time. The court is set to hear cases on issues including abortion and collective bargaining. And we have some sad news to bring you now from Hollywood. Actor Val Kilmer has died. His daughter tells U.S. media that he died of pneumonia yesterday in Los Angeles.
Congratulations on Top Gun. Thank you. Sorry to hear about Cougar. He and I were like brothers in flight school. He was a good man. Still is a good man. Yeah, that's what I meant.
That's Kilmer in one of his best-known roles as a fan favorite Iceman in Top Gun alongside Tom Cruise. And in 2022, he reprised that role in Top Gun Maverick, which was his final film. Kilmer was part of a small but elite list of actors who got to play Batman and won critical acclaim starring in The Doors, Tombstone, and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Kilmer was diagnosed with throat cancer in 2014, but had reportedly recovered from the disease at the time of his death. Today, director Michael Mann, who worked with Kilmer in the crime classic Heat, said he marveled at the actor's range and variability on screen. You're watching CBC News Network.